Everyone. I can see the Arctic gang is back together, the talking, the networking, that's what we love. Good morning, my name is Heather Conley. I'm Senior Vice President here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I always like to say when we can talk about the Arctic, it is a good day, so we're already going to start our day off right. Thank you for joining us. We are delighted to be in partnership with the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs and a consortium that's looking at the Russian Arctic. And so as part of this program, this is part of this half-day event, which has been generously funded by the Norwegian Research Council. It's an opportunity to look at the Arctic of the future, not only to dive deeply into Russia's very ambitious economic aspirations for the Russian Arctic, but to look at other aspects, and then to dive more deeply into the economic dynamics of the Arctic, something that will drive the Arctic of the future, whether that's Russia's economic plans, now China's plans, or looking at the wider, what we call blue economy. But there is absolutely no better way to start a discussion of the future of the Arctic than with the Commandant of the Coast Guard, Admiral Zukunft, whom, if I believe, sir, Zukunft in German is the future. So what perfect way to talk about the Arctic future. As Admiral Z, as we affectionately call him, the 25th Commandant of the United States Coast Guard, this is actually a moment, I have to say, of sadness, because 4 extraordinary years as Commandant of the Coast Guard, I wish the Arctic was his total focus. He somehow manages to keep his focus on it while he's juggling extraordinary responsibilities for interdiction in Latin America, cybersecurity issues. The Coast Guard is deployed in over 160 countries, and no one seems to know that. We're just so grateful that we see the Coast Guard and ever present on our coasts and helping to protect life through storms or through search and rescue. So what better way in many ways to say thank you than to invite Admiral Zukunft to give what I call his exit interview to help us understand and put into context the last 4 years. And he has been extremely busy, he and his Coast Guard colleagues. What he typically calls the Arctic, the fourth coast. I love that. I'm stealing that. But truly, the Coast Guard is our Arctic first responder. Very exciting developments. Admiral Z was the signer of the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, putting that historic structure into place. Recently announcing a vessel traffic management scheme for the Bering Strait with the Russian delegation to the International Maritime Organization. Some exciting news to upgrading the Coast Guard presence in Alaska with first response cutters and patrol boats. This is all exciting, but we all just really want to hear about the icebreaker, so I'm sure you will tell us that. But before I welcome Admiral Z to the podium, let me just say thank you. Thank you for your decades of public service. Thank you for defending our nation. And thank you for everything you've done for the Arctic. We're so grateful. So with your applause, and I want sustained applause, please, dear audience, please welcome Admiral Z.
Good morning, and Heather, I really do have to reciprocate, because if not for CSIS, this has really been our booster engine to get this rocket called the Arctic and some of the ways and means of how do we dress the Arctic off the ground. So it was about 4 years ago I was here, and we talked about the Arctic in, I would say, aspirational terms. And then we had an Arctic strategy, we had a national strategy for the Arctic region, and we went from aspirational to conceptual. Well, guess what? Now we are virtual. We have got 5 shipyards competing to start building heavy icebreakers. We have the appropriation to build 1.5. 6 is the number we need. But 4 years ago, people would say, there's no way you will get, we've been working this for 20 years and we will never get this program off the ground. But when you look at an icebreaker, that is the ways and means aspect of a strategy. So what's at play in the Arctic right now? We have an ocean that is opening up as ice recedes, and each year we're seeing record recedence of sea ice in the Arctic region. And then what is filling that vacuum? Human activity. Well, what kind of human activity? Much of it is economic related. If you look at the Yamal region, and certainly this is vital to Russia's economic security as they look at LNG coming out of Yamal, and when you have relatively ice-free or you have ice-capable LNG carriers that can make the shortcut through the Northern Sea route to support the European market. China. Why would not China want to be interested in the Arctic region as well, if they have the economic means to do so? And so what is at stake up in the Arctic? We know there's about 13% of the world's oil, about a third of the world's natural gas, rare earth minerals on the seafloor. Back in 2014, oil was trading at just over $100 a barrel. It then dropped to as low as $30 a barrel. Today it's trading at about $70.70. It's still a very volatile market, but we often look at extracting oil and gas through the short-term lens. Other countries view it as the long-term. Quite honestly, this is strategic reserves, if you will. Maybe not for today, maybe not for tomorrow, but when technology is brought to bear that can extract these natural resources for a profit. Yes, the United States is an Arctic region. So when I look at what are some of the strategic ends of the Arctic, one of those is clearly economic. The other one is security. We are looking at Russia militarize some of the islands that used to be predominantly for search and rescue. They will launch 2 ice-breaking corvettes that will carry cruise missiles that will ply the Arctic region as well. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do we protect our sovereign interests in the Arctic region, on the Fourth Coast? Well, what do you need an icebreaker to do? So it's no coincidence that we have stood up an integrated program office with the United States Navy to look at what do we need an icebreaker to do in the 21st century. 20, 30, maybe even 40 years from now, which is about how long these platforms are in existence. And if you don't factor in a military equation, you're probably a little bit short-sighted. And a lot of people ask me, so what weapon system would you put on there? I don't know what the weapon system is going to be of 2035. It might be directed energy. It might be something completely unique that isn't in our inventory today. But if you don't reserve space, weight, and power to accommodate those systems, if you truly have to exert sovereignty on the Fourth Coast, we need to be able to assure we have the flexibility to do that. As I've said in previous discussions here, the United States Coast Guard, in working with NOAA, we have mapped out the equivalent of the state of Texas being on our traditional 200-mile EEZ. And if you look at what's in our 200-mile EEZ and in our extended continental shelf, vast riches exist there. As one of the few nations, I always say, so what do Libya and what do North Korea and what do the United States all have in common? And you're probably saying, I'm not sure where that Venn diagram intersects. Well, it intersects with 3 countries that have not ratified the Law of the Sea Convention. And so absent ratifying, we really don't have the governance mechanism to declare our extended continental shelf, an area the size of Texas with vast riches. China is very interested in this very same area, and they view that as global commons. Why would they not? I can't fault them for doing that. And if they establish a pattern of behavior, and if we ratify the Law of the Sea Convention and decide, hey, this is ours, there's been a pattern of behavior with China and say, well, we traditionally operate there. Russia, on the other hand, has declared all the way up to the North Pole as part of their extended continental shelf. It's a bit of a stretch. And we've seen repudiation of the 9-dash line, but it has not stopped aspirations by other countries saying, well, we still declare the 9-dash line as ours. In this case, clearly I'm talking about China. So you have potential tensions arising with freedom of navigation. I don't anticipate that you will see ice-free Arctic year-round, but quite realistically, as early as 2030, with a number of studies, we may see an ice-free Arctic as early as 2030 in the, I would say the shoulder season, talking, July, August, September, maybe into October. The more viable route, quite honestly, is the Northern Sea route. It's a little bit more circuitous, going through the Northwest Passage. Last year, we sent a Coast Guard cutter through the Northwest Passage from Alaska to Baltimore, Maryland, over the top. But when the wind stacks up that ice, they can't move. So it is not ice-free year-round. And oh, by the way, when we did that, we worked with our Canadian counterparts, because Canada, like Russia, views the Northwest Passage as their internal waters. We interpret that as, no, this is international strait, and it is open for transit passage, which is our same interpretation of the Northern Sea route. We don't have agreement there. Those are policy decisions. Those are policy decisions that we, the United States Coast Guard, do not own. But if at some point in time we truly want to assert freedom of navigation, this would be a platform that you would use it with, an icebreaker, a U.S. icebreaker, a national asset. And so when I talked to the Secretary of the Navy, as we look at how many carrier strike groups we have, they said, well, how many heavy icebreakers do we have that can operate anywhere in the world? I said, we have one. And if one gets into trouble, we don't have a self-rescue capability. We might have to call on another nation to extract us, or we extract the crew and we literally abandon ship. It's a place where no service chief wants to find themselves without a self-rescue capability. Looking at the Arctic logistics, huge challenge up there. But to understand the logistic challenges, over the last several years, I've made a number of trips. When Shell was drilling up there, I noticed that they had a flotilla of 28 ships supporting that drilling activity. It was all sea-based and not shore-based operations. I went out a year and a half ago out to Greenland to visit the Jakobshavn Glacier on the west coast of Greenland. Now, when we flew over the ice fields, we noticed torrents of blue, crystal blue water going down moulins, big sinkholes, and where is all of that water going? It's going into the North Atlantic. Why is it leaving? Because temperatures are rising in the high latitudes. We met with the Inuit elders out in Disco Bay, which is normally frozen nearly year-round, and now it's ice-free year-round. And I said, what is happening here? He said, well, that glacier hadn't moved in the last millennium, but in the last 5 years, it's retreated 25 miles. That is glacial, that is the speed of light, if you will, for glacial retreat. This last year, I was up on the North Slope visiting a number of First Nation villages. We were in the village of Shishmaref. And when we flew in, the first thing I noticed were homes toppling into the ocean. As sea ice has retreated, that is a natural breakwater for winter storms. And right now, there are about 30 villages north of the Arctic Circle in Alaska that are endangered by erosion and a rising sea level. And what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. We had 52 inches of rain in Houston, Texas during Hurricane Harvey. Warmer air holds more moisture. And if you got to Hampton Roads, Virginia, during a spring tide, you have standing seawater in homes that were valued much higher than they are today because of a rising sea level, and then you have land subsidence. If you're down at the village of Ile de St. Charles in Louisiana, no one's home. That was a First Nation residence as well. About 140 people live there. We spent several $100 million to evacuate their tribal land because it is now going underwater. So sea level is rising. Call it what you want, but when I talk to the Inuit elders, they have a name for it, and it's called climate change. And so I don't get after the attribution of that, but as we look at sea ice retreat and water levels rise, and some of the modeling predict, we could have upwards of 2 meters by the end of this century. And it's very difficult to model melt in the Antarctic region. This is just Arctic melt as well. But that is at play as well, which means all the more reason, we need to have good domain awareness of what is happening in the high latitudes, what is happening in the Arctic. What do you need an icebreaker to do? I mean, I mentioned on the one side you weaponize it, but on the other hand, this is really the sentinel of the Arctic as well, to provide that domain awareness. Right now, our communications hover just above the horizon on the high latitudes. In fact, the United States Coast Guard is investing in CubeSats to improve our persistent coverage for search and rescue for distressed beacons. But the other logistic challenge, on February 26th, there was a 3,000-gallon diesel bladder that collapsed in Shuyak Strait, which is in the Aleutian Island chain. 3,000 gallons. Cost $9 million to clean up a 3,000-gallon oil spill. Tyranny of distance, of what it takes to stage an oil response, and this is on the Aleutian Island chain. What happens if you have an oil spill on the North Slope? If you want to talk logistic challenges, there is no bigger challenge than that. And then how do you get after that? Do you do it by investing in shore infrastructure, or do you invest in at-sea infrastructure, as Shell had done in the past as well? So yes, challenges persist. When we talk about miscalculations in the Arctic, the biggest miscalculation is if we literally freeze our relationships and look at the Arctic region through a unilateral lens, which is why we, the United States Coast Guard, created the Arctic Coast Guard Forum when the United States chaired the Arctic Council, to bring in all of the 8 Arctic Council members. And let's approach the Arctic region from a Coast Guard lens, first and foremost. What is at greatest risk? Clearly the environment. Less than 5% of the Arctic is charted to what we would say 21st century standards. So what if a vessel transiting encounters a seamount that's not charted, and now we have a vessel run aground up there? Search and rescue. How do we protect the norms of the First Nations that live up there as well? And more importantly, how do we share information, especially scientific information? Are fish truly going to migrate north? We declare a moratorium of fishing on the high latitudes, but it's just that. It's a moratorium without an enforcement mechanism as well. So this is an opportunity to really work by, with, and through the other Arctic Council nations with other Coast Guards. And we have a very transparent relationship. At the height of Hurricane Harvey, we were actually doing the largest ever search and rescue exercise hosted by Iceland this past September. Not a tabletop. We moved a Coast Guard cutter up there. We had aircraft, we had planes, but really look at some of the challenges of how soon can you arrive on scene? Where are the trauma centers in the Arctic? They're not there. Where do you build out logistic hubs? But more importantly, how do you communicate with 7 other nations besides the United States? How do you push information back and forth? And if you want to build trust and confidence in another nation, don't start with a freedom of navigation exercise. Start with something that's humanitarian in nature, such as search and rescue, such as environmental, such as we have a movement of fish moving into the high latitudes that could threaten the subsistence lifestyles of people who live up there. These are very near-term issues that especially indigenous residents of the Arctic are grappling with right now. And so let's work that, but work the relationship piece first. And so I'll bring it full circle with the relationship that we have had and enjoyed here at CSIS. And again, Heather, maybe we're going to name that first icebreaker the Conley. We'll see. It does. But no, I see a lot of brilliant minds in this room here today, and I would be remiss if I just sit here and go on and on. I'd really like to have an exchange with you as well. So let me cede the remaining time so we can have an open and frank discussion. Thank you very much.
Oh, Admiral Z, thank you. I know time is very short. I want to ask one question, and then I do want to open the floor. So this is in the spirit of an exit interview. What do you think in the Arctic portfolio, your greatest accomplishment and your greatest regret. So I'll let you hold that thought. And let me take one or two questions from our audience. If you could just identify yourself. Okay, I have 3 right across here, and I'll let you pass the microphone. Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Stuart Dye from Cleveland Maritime Group. My question relates to law of the sea. How critical is it for us to become a subscriber to that? Do you see any progress in that regard in strategic need sense?
Yeah, great question. And we've been working this for, since the Law of the Sea Convention was first promulgated. And here we are. I mean, when you start looking at Libya, North Korea, United States, among the non-ratifiers, and many people look to the United States. At the International Maritime Organization, they actually look to the United States Coast Guard as the governance model for all things maritime. But it's a little bit awkward if we haven't signed on to the rules of behavior, otherwise known as the Law of the Sea Convention. For us to truly be that leader in the maritime realm, we need to sign up to the ground rules. Ironically, a lot of discussion right now is about the Jones Act. The Jones Act of 1920. We need to revisit the Jones Act. It's old law. We need to get rid of it. So since you asked about law of the sea, if you have an opportunity, here's what happens if we repeal the Jones Act. All our coastwise trade will probably be done by a third nation, namely China. Not just coastwise trade, but plying our inland river systems as well. If we're looking at, hey, we can lower the cost of doing business, we can have a third nation do it on our behalf. The next thing that goes away are our maritime academies. You don't need them because we have foreign mariners. We don't know who they are, but they're foreign mariners plying our waters and our internal waters as well to conduct maritime commerce, which is a $4.6 trillion enterprise in the United States. And then the next thing that goes is our shipyards. Our shipyards and the technology that goes with the shipyards. So a segue from Law of the Sea Convention, but right now there's this fixation of we need to get after the Jones Act. That is not the time and place to go after Jones Act. This is much more strategic as we look at Law of the Sea, and the consequences of repealing the Jones Act could really have severe repercussions as well.
Admiral John Farrell from the Arctic Research Commission, thank you very much for all you've done for the Arctic, and thanks for inviting us to have a frank discussion. Appreciate that. You spoke passionately this morning and well informed about climate change in the Arctic. And you did say, however, that you didn't want to assign causality in a foreign policy article, and today you said you didn't want to assign attribution to that. I realize the Coast Guard is not a scientific organization, but there are scientific organizations that are very willing to assign attribution to that, to human activity. And even the White House U.S. Global Change Research Program does do a very nice job of assigning that attribution. So I think it's really important for Coast Guard to consider that as you plan 20, 30, 40 years out. You've got to get to that cause. Thanks. Yeah, John.
So again, what I look at is that empirical data. And the empirical data I look at is the carbon footprint that's been measured basically since our independence, acidification of the ocean, and then ocean temperature. And what you see is since our independence to present day, a 10,000-fold increase in carbon footprint. Along that same trajectory, you see rise in acidification of our oceans. Most people are not aware that over 90% of the Great Barrier Reef experienced coral bleaching this last year. And then with that, along that same trajectory, all 3 of these lines are perfectly in alignment with one another, with proportionality is a rise in ocean temperature as well. So that was then, and this is now. What's tomorrow going to look like? I have to deal with the consequence. And so when we start looking at, where do you build shore infrastructure in the future, you might want to build it where there's a 100-yard floodplain. Because as bad as the rain was in Hurricane Harvey last year, the year before they had an unnamed storm that dumped 26 inches of rain in Baton Rouge. No explanation for it. Why all the rain? So again, a lot of people can speculate why, but I have to deal with the consequence of that as well.
Caitlin Antrim, Rule of Law Committee for the Ocean. Thank you for coming. And since Law of the Sea has already been raised, I can turn to another topic of interest. In your work through the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, have you gotten a feeling for how Russia will use its new Arctic bases and new Arctic shipping in more a Coast Guard function of emergency response and such? Having bases that can hold 100 to 150 people in the dead of winter gives you an operating platform, or gives them an operating platform we can't match on the most traveled route. So I'm interested in seeing what you've been learning so far.
Well, we learn a lot, and obviously some of what I've learned I can't share in this format, but yeah, they are reinvesting in their distant search and rescue stations, but we're also seeing militarization of those very same facilities as well. So it's dual purpose. And again, there are sovereign interests. So if you look at all of the natural gas coming out of Yamal, going through the Northern Sea route, you'd probably ask yourself, it'd probably be in our best interest to be able to protect our sovereign interests as well, not just do search and rescue, but what if someone tries to encroach upon this unique trade route that we have that, arguably provides them a trade advantage over others, especially if you're declaring that as sovereign and not open to transit passage, and if someone were to challenge that. So we are seeing duality. Not just for search and rescue, but also militarization of these facilities as well.
I'm going to have you come back to my question. Your greatest accomplishment, your greatest regret?
So first of all, I do not believe in legacies. Legacies are cancerous, because as soon as you come into any position and say, this is going to be my legacy, it reminds me of Forrest Gump. You saw the movie, and he's running across the country several times. And then he finally stops in the middle of a desert somewhere. He goes, I'm tired, I'm going to go home now. And everyone behind him, they says, now what do we do? No, you want to make sure everyone keeps running in the same direction. And not only running, but running with fresh legs. So this has really been whole of Coast Guard, and not just whole of Coast Guard, but all of DHS. Getting DHS behind us as well to support where we are today. Going from aspirational to now virtual. Real ships, first heavy icebreaker will be delivered in 2023. My biggest regret is I won't be on active duty to have an opportunity to command that ship. So I think that would probably be my biggest regret, but maybe my only one. But it's been the fastest 4 years of my life. The support that we have seen on the Hill, the support we've had with this administration has been nothing short of phenomenal, with the administration and with the 115th Congress. And those are relationships that you build over 4 years, and it's not a baton you can say, okay, you now have a relationship with these people as well. It doesn't pass as smoothly as that. And so that'll be the next, the challenge will be of how do we establish those next relationships. Good news is my successor, Carl Schultz, has a lot of experience on the Hill. This is instinctive for him, and so I am very confident we're not going to drop this baton, and we're going to keep moving this thing forward. Thank you, Heather.
Well, Admiral Z, you have an extraordinary legacy, and we promise, in the spirit of Forrest Gump, we're going to keep running. And I actually think that icebreaker needs to be called Admiral Zukunft. So, with your applause, please thank Admiral Z for a great conversation, a great tenure.
Thank you.
Colleagues, if everyone will just stay seated, I'd like to invite our first panel forward, and then we're just going to escort Admiral Zukunft out, but please don't move. We are going to be right back in 1 minute. Thank you. hello. Thank you so much for your patience. This is when we sort of turn our tiles and get our scene change up. So I think Admiral Zukunft gave us a wonderful framework for the next part of our conversation, and we're just waiting for one more panelist, so we're going to start, and then when Professor Maureen Laurel comes in, we'll sneak her in the side. But you really can't talk about the future of the Arctic without talking about what I like to affectionately term the Russian Arctic superpower. 50% of the Arctic coastline, obviously important economic ambitions. Admiral Zukunft talked about a growing security posture in the Arctic. And so we're looking forward to diving into Russian ambitions economically and perhaps militarily, and what that tells us about the future of the Arctic. Let me begin by introducing my colleague, Dr. Julie Williamson, from NUPI, the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs. Julie is a senior research fellow. She has a long-standing research agenda looking at Russia from conflict resolution in the North Caucasus, widely published, and has been extremely thoughtful in thinking about Russia's Arctic ambitions. Many of you may be familiar with my other colleague, Dr. Paul F, the research professor at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. If you have not seen Pavel's Arctic blog, it's certainly one that I commend to you. Pavel has written extensively on Russia's military reform, again, conflict management in the Caucasus, Central Asia, energy, foreign and security policy, Russia's relationship with NATO, prolific writer, and we're so grateful that he also is on this research project. So let me begin and turn this to Julie for some framing comments, and then to Pavel, and then we will get into the discussion. Welcome and thank you.
I will be talking specifically on Russian-Norwegian relations. And I should start by saying that I'm not actually an expert on Arctic politics, but on Russian foreign and security policy, and on the conflict in Chechnya in particular. And the trigger for the paper, which this talk is based on, is an increasing frustration following 2014 with the tendency to analyze and understand Russian politics, and in particular Russian security policy, in isolation from the outside world, from what other states do. Because when you study conflict, you study interaction between parties, not because you want to attach blame or guilt, but because you want to understand the game and how escalation happens. So the question which my colleague Christian Gjerde and I asked ourselves is, will the so-called new war triggered by the crisis in Ukraine metastasize to the High North and inform Norwegian-Russian relations there? For those of you who don't know, those relations are characterized in excellent literature as particularly cooperative. The Arctic, or the High North as we call it in Norway, has been characterized by compromise and cooperation for over 20 years, if you look specifically at Norwegian-Russian relations. So our theoretical premise is that a state's foreign and security policy, say Russia's, is shaped through domestic relations, say how important are the security voices or the hawks in Russia, but they're also shaped through interaction on the international arena. How other states relate to Russia, what policy they pursue towards Russia, even small Norway, contributes to shaping Russia's choice of policy in the High North. So we have investigated the changing Norwegian-Russian interaction patterns in the High North from 2012 until 2017 by trying to pin down what kind of policy modes these two states have operated in. Is it basically what we call a realist policy mode, which privileges security concerns regardless of policy area? Is it an institutionalist policy mode, which privileges international regimes, institutions, and even in the security sphere, prioritizes committed institutional collaboration? Or was it a diplomatic management mode, characterized by careful adjudication between different courses of action within different policy areas. So the method has been just to try to establish what kind of policy mode these two states have operated in, how they have changed in the course of those years, and what kind of interaction between Norway and Russia it makes for. And since the rest of this day, I think, is going to deal with Russia extensively, I will cover Norwegian policies, just to try to show this interaction between the states. So if we go back and look at it during the Cold War, despite policies from both sides being pursued predominantly in what we call the realist mode, there were also policies pursued in the diplomatic management mode. And from the Norwegian side, very consciously, for example, through the so-called self-imposed restrictions, which meant, amongst other things, that Norway did not have foreign bases on Norwegian soil to reassure the Soviet Union that there would be no attack from the Western side, from the NATO side, towards the Soviet Union. And there was also very close bilateral cooperation, for example, in the fisheries. And this was a close cooperation which both sides pursued. Now, after the Cold War, Norwegian policies were pursued predominantly in the institutionalist mode. Norway sought to strengthen multilateral structures and legal regimes and bring Russia in. So, for example, Norway initiated in 1993 the Barents Euro-Arctic region. And then from 2005, if you look at Norwegian policies, you see Norway seeking institutional collaboration with Russia across issue areas in the High North, across every area nearly. However, Norway did not pursue committed institutional collaboration with Russia on security issues. Rather, Norway worked already from 2006-2008 to bring NATO's attention to the north and to give Norway a leading role in NATO. If we take a look on the Russian side, what we could term policies of neglect, which characterized Russia in the 1990s, were substituted by policies actually pursued more in the institutionalist and diplomatic management mode in the 2000s. And I think the agreement between Russia and Norway on the delimitation line in the Barents Sea from 2012 was a manifestation of what can grow out of this type of regional state interaction imprinted by an institutionalist policy mode. Now, if we zoom in on the Norwegian side from 2012 onward, Russia was talked about, and what we do is basically we've gone through hundreds of pages of Norwegian documents just to see how Russia is talked about and related to. So Russia was talked about as a partner across all issue areas, and even in policy areas where Russia is represented as a challenge in Norwegian discourse. The solution is always collaboration. And Russia's weak human rights or democracy credentials are not given much weight at all. Even Russian military modernization in 2012 in the High North is just represented as something normal, a return to normal, not a threat. So this Norwegian way of relating to Russia changed actually even before 2014, which is, of course, kind of an important point because it's the annexation of Crimea, as you all know. With the new Norwegian government from 2013 onwards, Russia was spoken more about as a rule breaker, and the Russian military modernization in the north was no longer represented as normalization, but as a sign of rising Russian great power ambition. And if we judge by MOD texts and initiatives, Norway's main collaboration partner in the north should not be Russia, but rather NATO. And security became a national priority in the north already at this time, at the expense of the other issue areas. So needless to say, this way of viewing Russia and relating to Russia was amplified after 2014 and the crisis in Ukraine. And even in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs text, we find that, you know, the way of relating to Russia is more as if Russia is pursuing power politics belonging to a different age. The parallels were drawn to, we haven't seen anything like this since the Second World War and so on. And so a stronger NATO in the north is now constituted as a condition for good relations with Russia in the north. And Norway has modified its self-imposed restrictions from the Cold War. We now have 330 US Marines at Værnes. We have exercises actually going a bit closer to the Russian border and definitely expanding in terms of how many soldiers participate in these exercises. We even have talks of Norway becoming a part of the missile shield. Whether that is going to happen or not is a different question. And importantly, I think here, Norway also dramatically scaled down diplomatic contact with Russia on the top level from 2014 until March 2017. Bilateral cooperation in concrete issue areas such as fisheries, search and rescue, nuclear waste, and so on, which are very important, continued. And I would say that this cooperation is now kind of bouncing back, but it was definitely affected after 2014. And the sanctions regime, which had the kind of unintended effect of reducing collaboration between Norway and Russia in the business sphere into a tool in a security-oriented conflict. And the interesting thing is to look back and see how it used to be considered as the kind of bridge-building mechanism in the High North for building trust and common interests between Russia and Norway, precisely the business opportunities. So does it matter that Norway pursues its policies towards Russia in the High North more through a realist mode these days? Does it affect Russia's way of relating to Norway in the High North? I think it does. Although one should not underestimate the domestic drivers of Russian politics in the High North. I think it does. And just as shifts in Norwegian policies towards Russia, of course, have been affected by the annexation of Crimea and the substantial military modernization, which play into this representation of Russia as a potential threat in the High North, Norway's way of talking about and relating to Russia, prioritizing in the High North, affects Russian policies. So if we go back to 2012 and look just shortly at it from the Russian side, Russian representations of the Arctic as an area of collaboration and as an area of opportunities for Russia were very distinct if you look at how Russia talked about the Arctic. At the same time, the clearest threat in this region was explicitly stated in 2012 to be that NATO would get involved. And that is, of course, precisely what Norway works for, with increasing persistence since 2014. And this is not a moral judgment. It's very understandable that Norway works for that, but it has a certain effect. And if you look at how Russia talks about Norway these days, it has changed. Norway has changed from being the partner in the High North to be NATO in the High North, or even the extended arm of the US, or even just a part of the US military system. This is clearly expressed in a whole row of statements by, for example, Foreign Minister Lavrov, and in comments by the Russian embassy in Oslo. And a whole set of what Norway considers small events, be it these American troops in Værnes, Norwegian contributions to military exercises in the Baltics, and so forth, all of these small events are construed as part of a buildup of the Western threat in the High North. And Russia acts on these perceptions in the realist mode, privileging security concerns regardless of policy area. So we have close to the Norwegian border not only an increasing number of SNAP military exercises, but we also have Norwegian businessmen who have worked in Russia for 20 years, now thrown out allegedly for being spies. spies, and we have lots of other examples. So I would like to just conclude that the Cold War is metastasizing to the High North and relations between Norway and Russia. And I think in a way which surprises many of us. Just 3 years ago, the verdict was more, it's happening in Ukraine, it's not going to shape our relations up north, and the Arctic and the High North is a particular space. But at least through the texts we have been looking through, it looks as if this unfortunately is happening. And the point of my talk is kind of just to say that we're going to miss why this happened if we don't look at the combination of policies on both sides. So for those of us who usually just study Russia, it has become important to look at also how Russia interacts with the states around. Thank you.
Julie, thank you so much. You're absolutely right. Norway is a wonderful indicator of both patterns of cooperation, but potential tensions. I think I would probably respectfully submit that the high north low tensions should probably be substituted with high north potential tensions, as Admiral Zukunft had mentioned. Okay, Pavel, we're very anxious for your insights as you have observed all of these small steps, as Julie said.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you some of my analysis on these matters, and I'm really glad to be a part of this research undertaking together with CSIS, which is coming to an end. It was a 3-year-long project. Every project comes to an end, and I have to admit that at the end of the project, I do not have many firm conclusions. I have more questions than answers. I have more worries than recommendations. And that's why I'll try to cut my presentation shorter, kind of throwing at you my worries and doubts rather than concrete propositions. The bottom line is, and I am researching the Russian part of the whole complex Arctic puzzle. Yes, Russia is an Arctic superpower, and it is a very confused superpower. My bottom line is that Russia's Arctic policy has stopped working. And it is probably a questionable proposition because so many conclusions and recommendations take Russia's might in the Arctic as a point of departure, and we'll proceed from there about how to address that. I see that might as a very problematic proposition. In a sense, when I started doing research on the Russian Arctic policy, and for me, kind of as for many others, the point that triggered my interest was Chilingaro's flag planting expedition. So I wrote my first report soon after that in the year 2007. A lot of things have changed, but even back then I thought that there is an interesting combination in the Russian Arctic policy. There is an emphasis on developing international cooperation and in particular in economic ties, and there is a different track of militarization, of increasing Russian military activities, presence, infrastructure, and so on. And these tracks were never really perfectly coordinated and never in harmony, very often in conflict with one another. Nevertheless, it was possible to proceed along both, generally achieving results on each of them, and that's no longer the case. You cannot proceed on both. Neither path is actually working, is yielding you profits and results you would expect. And in a sense, this situation is somewhat similar to Putin's famous address to the parliament on March 1st, which also consisted of two parts, the economic and the missile part. And compatibility between the two parts was non-existent, but that was not the most striking part. Probably for me, the most interesting was that neither part has any chance of being implemented. That economic breakthrough he was kind of describing in this economic situation with this economic policy is impossible. And all these fancy missiles, wonder missiles, cannot be produced and built on this economic foundation. A bit of the same happening in the Russian Arctic policy, and we will be discussing why exactly kind of the economic situation and the international cooperation is not yielding any more the profits and results in the second part of the seminar. I will concentrate more on the on the hard security, on the military part of the equation, in which you can distinguish three different elements. All the Russian military, there is probably more. Three is just a convenient number. And one is the strategic nuclear capabilities, very much concentrated on the Kola Peninsula. There is a lot of investment in their modernization. Sustained program focused on the introduction of the new generation of nuclear submarines, which was the single most expensive project in the whole armament program, which is now coming to an end, and it will continue to be the single most expensive project in the new one, which after a long delay is recently approved towards the year 2027. Not everything is going well with this big project, particularly with the missile, with the Bulava missile, which is the main weapon system for this new generation of submarines. Nevertheless, it is generally rational and well-established track. You need to modernize your sea leg of your nuclear triad, simply because the old submarines have to be taken out of, have to be retired, out of circulations. For some of them, the time is very ripe. They are long past the expiration date. And it is gradually happening, probably slower than other some risk assessment would prescribe. Nevertheless, this is a part of the military activities for which there is very little question. Yes, it has to be done. This investment needs to be sustained. You are somewhere in the halfway through this very huge and expensive project. You cannot stop now, whatever the resource shortages. The second element is the militarization of the Northern Sea route, which was mentioned by the commander, and it is really something new, because for that matter, Russian Northern Fleet, mighty as it was in the Soviet days, never had any capabilities of going east, of working in the ice waters. It never had any ice-class ship, for that matter. It was always going west into the Atlantic. Now they are experimenting with the cruises in the eastern directions, which is very hard for these ships. Always have to be accompanied by icebreakers. And the program of building the ice-class ship is not going very well. And the new bases which are appearing along the Northern Sea route are not really very mighty bases. Yes, combination of military capabilities and search and rescue is at least one good thing about them. But overall, you look at the rationale of that part, and you cannot avoid the conclusion. It is about meeting the non-existent threats. It is about asserting your sovereignty in the what-if scenarios. Which, yes, sometimes makes some sort of sense, but probably not in the situation Russia is presently in. Investing in the what-if scenarios is a luxury you can sometimes afford, but not when your economy is in that situation, and not when you have that many real challenges facing you. Probably North Korea being the best example in this regard. North Korean test site is closer to Vladivostok than to Pyongyang. And what is Russia doing in meeting this very real security challenge? The short answer is nothing. Russia is not a part of these talks. Russia is not building up military capabilities there, is not doing anything of any significance in meeting this threat. It is investing in the military bases along the Northern Sea route, which is not threatened in any meaningful way by anybody. To what degree this is sustainable? Yeah, it is, again, possible to argue back and forth. I am not particularly worried about that part of the Russian military preparations. I am more worried about the third element, which is increasing your military capabilities of conventional type on the Kola Peninsula, building, in fact, a position of strength and military dominance in that area, including the anti-access area denial bubble. That concept is non-existent in the Russian military strategy. It is very often invented for the Russians by the Western military analysts very successfully. But nevertheless, the capabilities are there. Russia cannot build anymore the strategic bastion in the Barents Sea. The Northern Fleet is not strong enough for that. But what it can build is this very particular bubble and building up conventional capabilities supporting that. That is where... Very good, yes. Those naval bastions were really a great part of Soviet blue water strategy. Gorshkov was a big enthusiast of that. It required so many ships that were never really convincingly built even in the Soviet times. And now the Northern Fleet is so overstretched, performing some missions even in Syria, that nothing resembling a bastion could be built there. And we have also to say that the Navy is generally, by and large, a designated loser in the new rearmament program, and the shipbuilding isn't going well at all, even if there is hardly any admission of that in the official discourse. But nevertheless, too much evidence have accumulated to show that there are deep problems there, and part of them partly related to sanctions, partly to many other issues in the shipbuilding. It is not really a significant threat. But nevertheless, this is the picture of these three elements, and the main question is, what now? Where from here? Or to put this question in a kind of academic way, is Russia going to be a status quo or a revisionist power in the High North? And generally, from a power in decline, you would expect status quo policy. You would expect trying to cling to the situation which benefits it institutionally and in many other respects. And Russia, as very often, in my opinion, is an exception from this rule, a power in decline which has very pronounced revisionist tendencies. And when I'm spelling this message in the Arctic conferences, very often it's a strong rejection of that proposition from many stakeholders in the Arctic policies. There is a very strong lobby which is really committed to developing cooperation in the High North, which is principally a good thing. Cooperation and building cross-border ties is a goal worth pursuing. The tradition in that milieu is generally bracketing out, ignoring completely what is happening in the hard security domain. In every institution, from the Arctic Council, the Barents Cooperation, people are saying all the military matters are none of our concern. That's somebody else's business. And my worry is that it's not possible to ignore that anymore, because Russia has invested so much in building up its military might in the High North and is able to harvest so little dividend from that, that this position is not anymore kind of a luxury you can afford. It is something you really have to change. Yes, you can scale back your military preparations. You can cut down on these expenditures, which are not really necessary, whatever your threat assessment are, whatever your imagination can put as far as kind of NATO capabilities and US intentions, and Russians are very good at that. But the moment you become real with your threat assessment, you discover that your position of strength on the Kola Peninsula is invincible. Nobody can possibly threaten that. And building further that position of strength means that you are acquiring capabilities well beyond what is necessary for kind of defending and protecting your interest. You are kind of now building capabilities for projecting power. What forms and shapes would that take? Whether Svalbard, which is in the dark part of that bastion defense, is a lowest hanging fruit, is a kind of target of opportunity. Yes, there is a lot of need to think about this. It is a very peculiar international law phenomenon, Svalbard with its kind of old treaty, with its with Russia being able to maintain presence there, demilitarized for that matter, which makes it all the more attractive as a target of various hybrid operations by the polite green men, or not particularly polite for that matter. That's kind of one part of my concern. My more serious concern is about that Russia has invested so much in its nuclear capabilities that it cannot afford this investment to remain idle. It needs to bring its nuclear might somehow into political game, to make it a useful instrument of policy, probably not by staging a nuclear strike, but somehow increasing the prominence of that element of its power, making it kind of count for more, because you have all this power and it's not working for you. It's remaining idle. One way to bring that into political fray is, again, in my very dark thoughts, is resume nuclear testing. And there is a nuclear test site on the Novaya Zemlya, which has remained out of use since the last nuclear test more than 30 years ago. Novaya Zemlya, by the way, on this map is not exactly right. It consists of 2 islands instead, not one very long one. But still, the nuclear test site is not completely shut down. There are some testing going there. One of Putin's Wonder missiles, in fact, was tested on that site. Staging there kind of a small nuclear explosion will not even violate international law, because the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is not in force as yet, partly because the United States have not ratified, by the way. It's not only an issue with the Law on the Sea Convention. And that probably is the kind of the dark part of my worry, and I'm spelling it out with the hope that it's not going to happen. And that's the rest of my worries and concerns. Thank you very much for your attention.
Pavel, thank you. That's a lot of darkness to unpack, I think. But we're going to take our opportunity. I was struck with both of your comments, thinking about Svalbard and putting Svalbard back into some context, and I want to get to that in a moment. Julie, let me start with some questions and then bring you both into the conversation. You know, what's striking to me about Russian-Norwegian relations, this incredible moment of promise in 2010 when the maritime border, the demarcation of the maritime border, which really encouraged energy production, seismic work, activity, things like that. When sanctions were imposed, and of course Norway is not a member of the European Union, but Norway is following that sanctions regime, a lot of Norwegian economic activity was what we call grandfathered, meaning it was still allowed to proceed, but new investment. Help us understand on the energy spectrum in particular, what is the relationship today between Norwegian energy industry and Russian energy industry? Because energy, Arctic energy, is so important for Russia to eventually, if it can, and Pavel's quite pessimistic about their economic aspirations, but it's going to be energy that's going to, and mineral resources that's going to pull them out. What is the status of the energy-economic relationship between Norway and Russia today?
I don't know if I'm the right person to answer. I think I might, on the I can give it a shot. Well, of course, the great optimism which I was describing, which actually starts long before 2010, is related to the fact that we are going to find a lot of energy resources in the Arctic, and that Norway and Russia would cooperate on that, and that Norway has the technology, Russia needs the technology, and a lot of expectations, for example, relating to the Stockman field. But that was, that was one of many aspects where Norway and Russia were going to collaborate, and where they have mutual interests, in addition to the classical fields of fisheries and so on. And of course, even if the Stockmann field did not, that cooperation did not work out, and that was clear long before 2014, there was still, it still didn't affect, Norwegian-Russian relations negatively. And then I think when you come to 2014, and Norway decides to just, in fact, in a way, copy the sanctions regime from the EU, without considering, how will it affect energy relations or business relations. You had a consensus that this is the right thing to do because it was considered kind of a soft response to Russia's actions in Ukraine. And I gave some talks together with people who do work in this field at the time, and I know they were very unhappy because it would affect, the possibilities of collaborating on energy issues. But they still very loyally kind of followed suit. As I have understood now, not only in terms of energy, but in business relations in general, people are finding ways of, and in the fisheries, for example, importantly, ways of kind of moving around the sanctions, and that some of it, some of it stays intact actually, but still the result is that these economic relations have been, security is prioritized on top of those economic relations, and that remains the same. But if you look at the Norwegian debate, I would say that what I characterized as more realist-oriented policies, that the debate is changing a bit in the sense that these other voices in the Norwegian society are coming back, and also the voices that say, okay, so we used to have both deterrence and reassurance in our relations with the Soviet Union, and it actually gave us security. We need to find back to that balance between, yes, deterring, but at the same time pursuing policies in other issue areas and pursuing diplomatic contact, so that we can, build and continue our good bilateral relations in these other spheres. Yeah.
We had an event yesterday afternoon on 4 years of Russian sanctions and its impact on Russian foreign policy and the Russian economy. I have to say one notable quote was, to your soft answer, we impose sanctions before we send soldiers. And in some ways, right now we have in Norway sanctions and soldiers, and I have to say, speaking of darkness, there was not a lot of optimism in the room that sanctions will be lifted anytime soon. So we're going to be, I think, in this period. Pavel, let me ask you. This gets back to what really caught my attention in your comments was about the power projection capabilities on the Kola Peninsula that go well beyond what we would normally see, and this gets to a question on Russian claims to extend the outer continental shelf. And I'm always the first one, I don't know, I'm sure you all, how many journalists have phoned and said, oh my goodness, the claimant process. And I'm always the first one to say, no, Russia is following the international legal framework of UNCLOS. This is exactly what we do. We submit claims, they're adjudicated, and then bilateral or trilateral talks have to proceed. But I have this suspicion, concern, that if this process does not unfold and there's concern and anxiety about Russia's claims to extend the continental shelf, could some of that Kola power projection capabilities be used as intimidation for that? Now, I'm falling into Pavel Bayev's darkness, but if you want to think, just help me understand these claims, which are absolutely being followed appropriately, correctly, nothing wrong with that. But is there a dark side that we should be thinking about as well?
Yes, it is an interesting question, but let me first take a half a shot at your first question. And I think it is quite remarkable that the whole and a large part of the energy connection between Russia and Europe is exempt from sanctions. Russian oil and gas keep flowing through Ukraine, despite all the troubles there, into Europe with no interruptions. There were all sort of worries about Russian gas weaponization of energy, and through that period of confrontation, the energy area, energy connection, energy export functions just fine, with the single exception of the High North. It's exactly there where energy ties and projects are affected by the sanctions. So it is somewhat a paradoxical contrast with the ideas of bracketing the North out of the confrontation, keeping the cooperative ties in the High North there, making that as an exception of the general confrontation. So there is a bit of a clash between these two things. And your point about sanctions and soldiers, it is still sanctions are imposed on Russia, and still they're not soldiers on Russian soil. Those soldiers are in Norway. You're not sending soldiers together with sanctions. It's still a different story. But as far as Russian power projection capabilities and the Russian claim is concerned, yes, claim is perfectly legitimate. If there is one point where I disagree with the commander, is about the analogy with the 9-dash zone. That is a unilateral declaration that goes against every point in the Law on the Sea Convention. Russia is following the international law by the book. It has submitted its claim to the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. It's waiting patiently for the verdict. The verdict is not going to come anytime soon, because there is a clash with the Danish claim and possibly also with the Canadian claim, which is yet to be submitted this year, probably. And the Commission cannot make any recommendation on the overlapping claims. It generally tells the claimants, go out and sort out your differences and then come back. And Russia is not generally doing anything to demonstrate that it's going to proceed unilaterally. It's not showing any revisionist behavior in this regard. And the capabilities for power projection are mostly in that part you see on the map, on the western, essentially the ice-free territory, while the claim is way east between the Lomonosov and Mendeleev regions. And the Arctic is not a small region. Your power projection capabilities here are not very useful there. And they are not particularly suitable for operating in the really icy claims, because what they consist of partly is the new capabilities for long-range cruise missile strikes on very small naval platforms that can operate only in the ice-free waters. Also of the strengthened capabilities in terms of amphibious operations. Again, you can do that only in the ice-free waters, even if you train for fighting in the snow. And the Russians are not really hiding this particular part of their training, advertising it very strongly, how tough the Marines and the new Arctic brigades are in this respect. You can stage, and it was staged, very high risk jump from the high altitude to the North Pole, which is, truth be said, a crazy operation to perform, really taking risk way beyond acceptable by Western standards. But the value of that is essentially a show which tells that you can perform that this sort of operations where it really matters, not over the North Pole, but again, Svalbard, maybe even Greenland, maybe northern Norway are far more attractive targets than doing anything there where there is nothing except the underwater regions, which you can claim only symbolically, because you cannot do anything there. You don't have technology, you don't have infrastructure, you don't have platforms which can operate there. If you are going to make use of your accumulated power ready for being projected, it is somewhere much more in this region and not out there.
So I went. Two quick questions, and I want to turn to our audience. I know I have lots of questions for both of you. The first one, President Putin has put an enormous amount of prestige on the Arctic. He speaks about it often. He witnesses both economic opportunities like in Yamal and military exercises. He's deeply involved in this. What happens if this project fails, or can it fail because he's put so much prestige to it? And then I know we're going to talk about this in the second panel, but I want to China's entrance, and certainly we've seen an enormous amount of Chinese diplomatic and economic activity across the Nordic countries. Certainly China's investment, both financial and technology, at the Yamal LNG project has been substantial. How has that changed the dynamic, or at least perhaps changed Russia's interaction, either economically or in security? So Julie, I'll let you take a whack at both those questions, and then Pavel, then we'll turn to our audience.
I think I will concentrate on the first one, and the perception that, which Pavel also in a way spoke about in his talk, that if you have all these ambitions, if you have invested so much, then inevitably you will use it. And I think I would like to question that perception, and the point of my point was in a way to say that, the point of my talk was to say that, to start out with, both sides really looked at the Arctic as this collaborative space of opportunity, where it is in both our interest to cooperate, and actually did not speak of the other party as a threat at all. And there is, to start out with, then non-existent. That's the word you use. But I think the interesting question is, how are we getting into this kind of dynamic in the Arctic, that actually there is a threat there? Russia is not only protecting its national interests, but they might have offensive intentions. And on our side, Russia is not normalizing with this modernization in the Arctic, but it is potentially becoming a threat. So I think I would rather, to continue the analysis, I would rather focus on that. How is this dynamic developing? How do we get there? And I think the importance of looking at the less tangible aspects of the relations, not just counting capabilities, but really whether the relation is moving, is extremely important, because it is a fact that the way that we have viewed Russia in Ukraine is now affecting our way of viewing Russia in the north. And that's, in a way, the big problem. And on the Russian side, I don't think necessarily that it's only because they want to use the capabilities they now have, but it is the fact that they didn't see us as a threat in the north before. But they are starting to. They are starting to focus on NATO and just forget about this other part of Norway, which is actually still there. So I think that's my main concern, is not so much that Russia has ambitions to govern that space, to protect its sovereignty and so much, and has the capabilities to do that in the north, but that we're getting into this conflictual relation. And how then suddenly you have a rationale for putting those capabilities into offensive action. And both parties seem to be getting there. They're relating to the other party as a threat. So that's, in a way, the game which I think is the big challenge here. It's the interaction, the way of viewing each other, and the lack of trust. And for me, very importantly, good that we have like the Arctic Council and the BEAR cooperation, where we can still talk. But if you look at what happens even in those councils, the talk is becoming much more of a just, presenting your stand and not really moving towards cooperation. So I think that's a twisted answer to your question, but that's my main worry. It's the interaction here. It's the relational thing.
Well, I think as we focus on the security, less the economic and the environment, which of course the Arctic Council can do, security is out of the realm of all of these institutions. We have no place to go with this conversation to increase transparency, increase confidence building measures. This doesn't fit nicely into anything, and all we keep hearing is, well, we can't deal with this. I agree with Pavel. We risk now of enhancing that cycle of conflict because we simply do not have a venue to do this. The NATO-Russia Council is not a venue. It's not going to be the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. We don't have a place to do this, and so we're continuing to slide into this. And we've got NATO's major exercise this fall, Trident Juncture, which will be a Norway-centric exercise. NATO's so we keep going, but there's no place to talk about this. Pavel, your thoughts, and then I hope you can express some views on China.
Yes, I will come to China, but I want to address another part of your question about Putin's personal feelings about the Arctic. And it is a question open to interpretations, because I very often feel that Putin is personally interested, has some sort of again, Arctic feeling, which many experts for that region cherish. And for that matter, there was a series of these kind of international conferences, Arctic as a territory of dialogue, one year after another, and they stopped in the year 14. And there was no conference in the year 15 and no conference in the year 16. What we were hearing in that period, not from Putin, but from the Russian top brass, was that the Arctic is one of the key priorities in our strategic planning. Not the Far East, not the Caucasus, not Central Asia, the Arctic. And then suddenly, in the year 17, it is again the conference. And Putin is speaking there again and saying international cooperation, and let's keep the dialogue going, which is probably a better message than emphasizing strategic priorities for the Arctic. But nevertheless, you cannot really put much trust in these feelings. After all, Putin had a lot of personal interest in the Stockman project, was really following it very closely. And then Norway decided to pull out because it didn't make economic sense. And what was the consequence? Nothing. Putin forgot about the project, and which might tell you about his interest, to what degree that is a factor here. And now to China. Russia's attitude towards China's ambitions in the Arctic has always been very ambivalent. Russia was very unhappy about China's claim to become an observer in the Arctic Council and was blocking it for many years, and then finally agreed. I think what changed that attitude somewhat was this Yamal LNG project, which again had extremely weak economic rationale, much as Stockman, and needs heavy subsidies from Russian state, and even these subsidies were not enough until China stepped in and saved the whole project, and provided money and agreed to buy the gas. If the Russian subsidies continues, the economics of the whole enterprise continues to be very shaky. And even from China, my reading is it was much more a political gesture than real interest in this LNG, which is abundant on the market. For China, it's an interesting experiment. For Russia, it is really a matter of crucial importance. This asymmetry doesn't bode well for these relations. And after rescuing the project, China feels much more confident vis-à-vis Russia in its Arctic ambitions, issuing now the new white paper and making these ambitions known, not expecting any sort of response from Russia, not expecting any objections or else, because for Russia now the cooperation with China in the High North is the only thing that really works, and the only hope they might have, despite China having no technology, no experience in working in this water. The only thing China has is funding. And for many Russian projects in the High North, that is a crucial matter. Sustaining all these bases in the eastern part along the Northern Sea route is a very expensive proposition. They are maintenance heavy, even if they are small bases, and there is no supporting civilian infrastructure. So you start cutting your defense budget, as it is already happening. You start economizing on that, and you can expect that these bases will really suffer. Thank you.
Fantastic. All right, we've got I see the hands shooting up. This is exciting. Let's bring our audience in. We'll start in the back, please, Matt or Max. Could you introduce yourself, and then we'll take 2 or 3 questions, and then I'll return to you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a remarkable 2 sessions here. Thank you. My name's Anita Parlow, and I worked on I was the team lead actually for the launching project of the Wilson Center on the Polar Code in the Bering between Russia, Canada, and the U.S. And I recently was on a Fulbright in Iceland looking at offshore petroleum development between Iceland and Norway, which was to be with CNOOC, not going to happen, and finished recently a law review article on distributive justice and offshore natural resources development, and just finished a project on villages sliding into the sea in Alaska. So my question, not to sound a little teensy bit contrarian in terms of a question, it relates ultimately to China and Russia, and the questions of U.S. What is the U.S. policy that's driving some of this ship? For example, as mentioned, U.S. is not a signatory to UNCLOS, yet likes to think in terms of an area the size of Texas, so which hasn't exactly been demarcated as a scientific matter or brought to the proper authorities. What about the Northern Sea Route, as also was mentioned in the Northwest Passage, where the U.S. views as international waters, which the nations of record of concern view as internal? And what about icebreakers? We're talking about domain awareness in a region, and we have one and another one on the way. Somebody once made a comment that the way U.S. talks about icebreakers, it's as though we're a landlocked country in Latin America or sub-Saharan Africa. And we're pretty good on the way below the water and way up in the sky, but on the top of the water, we don't seem to be that good. And sanctions are going on. I'll get there, I promise. And we have, as a result, or would have happened anyway, relations between China and Russia economically, and the development that is occurring in China viewing itself as a near-north nation. My concern and question is, down the road, as we look at these things and have been discussed in somewhat pessimistic terms, although I think the Norwegian-Russian model is the model to go by, is when does the U.S. or would the U.S. start to view the transiting up through the Northern Sea Route and the Bering in military terms as a threat in some manner, and suddenly view a trade situation that would be growing and evolving in a manner that would threaten U.S. interests? And forgive my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you. We'll have a question up here, Steve. Yep, it's coming. Microphone's coming. Thank you. Please introduce yourself.
Stephen Blank, American Foreign Policy Council. My question is to both members of the panel. Given the importance of energy, oil and LNG in the Arctic to Russia, I'd like you to go out a few years, because all the analyses I'm reading tell me that the price of energy over the long term is going to go down as renewables become more available and cheaper. And to the extent that renewables supplant demand for energy, what then happens to Russia's Arctic enterprise?
Thank you. I think we have one up here. Matt, just one more, and then we'll pause here and take that. Yes. Hey, Charlie.
Charlie Ebinger with the Atlantic Council. I was wondering to what degree Norway does any kind of coordination with its neighbors in Sweden and Finland vis-a-vis the Russian military buildup, and also to what degree Russia perhaps uses differences among the Scandinavian nations to its advantage.
All right. Pavel, I'll start with you, and then we'll work our way down to Julie.
I would probably leave the first questions to you, Heather.
Now, I was waiting for you to talk about U.S. policy.
You're a legitimate member of our panel, and as far as U.S. policymaking on the Arctic is concerned, I am not really an expert of that. I was going to very hopeful about U.S. chairmanship in the Arctic Council, but I think where U.S. did a pretty good job. But I'm worried about after that is done, about the diminishing and declining interest, and I hope it will not happen. Let me touch upon the issue of energy, which is one of the, as far as Russian Arctic discourse is concerned, that is very often perceived as an axiom. that Arctic is a treasure chest of the energy resources. There is kind of a lot of it there, and in many ways it is a mythology for which the only real bit of data very often misinterpreted and presented in entirely surrealistic terms is the estimate of US Geological Survey from the year 2007, long overtaken by the shale revolution, but still in circulation. There is no other reference point in all the Russian discourses. And yes, in that estimate there is a nice figure about undiscovered resources which really cannot be estimated with any precision. Nevertheless, that is seen as the proof positive of the richness of the Arctic in the energy resources. And my reading is that these resources, not just in the near term, but also in the mid-term, and we know nothing about long-term, will not be accessible, available in any way useful for exploitation, exploration, and development. Russia's kind of future as an energy superpower, which it is much more onshore, and not even with the new discoveries, but with the old Soviet exhausted oil fields, which were exhausted with the Soviet technology, but nevertheless contain a lot if you apply new technologies there. And the infrastructure is there, and kind of, it's far easier, cheaper, and economically rational. Only Russia needs access to this technology, which is presently banned by sanctions. In the kind of mid-term, let's kind of try to break it out, the present confrontation. If that is lifted, Russia has a generally bright future, and as the energy producer and exporter, without any offshore Arctic dimension, which will always remain cost inefficient, very risky, and entirely unnecessary. So that is my take. As far as cooperation between the Nordic is concerned, again, looking from Russia, the most worrisome part of that cooperation, the darkest cloud, is Finland and Sweden joining NATO. So every step in the Nordic cooperation is perceived through that particular lens. And kind of Russia is watching very closely how suddenly the public opinion in Sweden, which is always so firmly neutral, is shifting very clearly in the direction that NATO membership is generally a good idea. It's less so in Sweden, less so in Finland, but even there, many kind of new initiatives, like the creation of the Center of Excellence for dealing with the hybrid threats, are seen in Russia as Finland getting closer to NATO, which is a worry, which is perceived again as a part of the Western revisionism.
Before I turn to Julie, Charlie, it's interesting this week, the Swedish and Finnish defense ministers are meeting with Secretary Mattis as part of a trilateral defense dialogue between the U.S., Sweden, and Finland. So just to echo Pavel's view that obviously Russia's activities in the region have propelled Sweden and Finland to think about embracing a more robust defense posture. Sorry, Julie, I just put a caveat that.
Yeah, I think I'm going to leave the question on U.S. policy to Heather as well. But I would just like to make a comment tied to my own small intervention, because what I was trying to shed light on is what happens when everything seems to be subsumed under this security logic. So the question, when does the US start to view trade routes as a threat, is precisely when the entire national discourse is becoming so preoccupied by Russia as a threat that it sees absolutely everything that Russia does as a threat. And this is a social fact in a way, which I can observe in Norwegian society, and I'm sure you can observe it here. So I think that you have to watch how Russia is talked about and related to here in the US, and then you unfortunately find that actions which should not be interpreted as actions of threat or assertive actions actually become interpreted as such, simply because of the way we view Russia as an actor as a whole. So that's a big part of the problem here. Then secondly, if energy or oil, is substituted and is not going to be so important any longer, is the Arctic going to be less important for Russia? Well, certainly Russia will have, its oil-dependent economy will have less capacity to act in the Arctic. On the other hand, you have to look at the map, The Arctic is an important part for Russia, is always going to be in terms of sovereignty. Look at the Bastion defense, up there. And also it's fair to say that Russian policies on the Arctic are very broad. They include whatever is going on there and whatever is said to be important up there. So I don't think even if energy is going to not be viewed as so important, the Arctic is still going to be important for Russia. And then in terms of the change of the setup in the north, it is quite substantial, and it's a big part of the problem. Yes, that if you look at those countries, it used to be, with Norway's self-imposed restrictions during the Cold War, yes, Norway had a border with Russia, and Norway was a NATO member, but it was still kind of more of a neutral zone because we did not have nuclear weapons on Norwegian soil, we did not have American troops on Norwegian soil, and we had this very conscious policy of reassuring the Soviet Union. And then, of course, you had the Swedish neutrality and Finland. So all the talk which is going on, could there be NATO membership? That's one thing. But the other part is that in practice, Sweden and Finland are already collaborating very closely with NATO. And you see it, when there's an exercise like there just was, then, the point of the U.S. Marines in Norway, for example, is to be able to easily bring them over to the, what you call this, Östersjön, the Baltic Seas, so it's all actually already part of an integrated system, which includes these three states to a much stronger degree than during the Cold War. So the whole aspect of kind of a buffer zone between the US and Russia here of neutrality, it's not there any longer, seen from the Russian perspective.
2 seconds on U.S. policy, and I promise I'll hold a separate panel on this because it's worthy of it. We have been largely missing during the Cold War. We had an understanding of the geostrategic importance of the Arctic. Both Alaska was for energy security for the U.S., and we understood it was the quickest way to get to the North Atlantic and the North Pacific. And that all went away at the end of the Cold War. We largely, to use Julie's term, have an institutional approach to the Arctic, using the Arctic Council and other multilateral forum, because our identity as an Arctic nation is the weakest among the 5 coastal states. And we write strategies and hope that that will suffice for lack of budget and lack of policy action and direction. The title of this panel actually was meant to provoke because you now have 3 countries that have very different visions of the Arctic. The U.S. does not see this as a strategic imperative. It just will not put the funding forward for that, because if it would do a lot of different things. Russia, it's a strategic imperative. China, for me, it's growing into, to use Paul's term, an experiment in potential of strategic value and nature. So what are the costs to the United States if our 2, according to our national security strategy, our peer competitors view the Arctic strategically, yet we do not? And that's what decision makers now have to understand. It's no longer just okay to be status quo, the same policy we've had since the mid-90s, which it's largely had. Is there now a strategic consequence if our 2 peer competitors have an entirely different view of the Arctic? Whether China will invest in LNG infrastructure in Alaska, whether the militarization of Russian Arctic islands poses a potential to limit U.S. ability to operate in its Arctic. Those are the questions we have to discuss. So maybe if we can't get there, if the U.S. can't get to this policy decision by itself, perhaps it has to view it through the lens of being pushed out of the Arctic. So more to come in that thought. We have a couple minutes, and I knew there were some questions over here. If we can take them quickly, and then I promise coffee is in your future. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thanks. I'm Neela Banerjee with Inside Climate News. I wanted to ask a little bit about the notion of, the climate change has brought with more melting in the Arctic, more open routes, more possibility that perhaps Russia and other countries see. When the U.S. military sometimes discusses the Arctic, there's also a sense of vulnerability with melting permafrost affecting infrastructure and so on. I was wondering whether Russia, from your perspective, sees or is facing any threats from climate change to its both its military and its commercial infrastructure through that region. First of all, whether those threats exist, and secondly, whether Russia is actually doing anything about them and responding to them, and to make a more resilient infrastructure there. Thank you.
Fantastic question. Julie, you want to start that one and then turn to Pavel?
Yes, and just to stress that I'm not an expert on Russia's Arctic policies, but I did go through these documents and official Russian documents on how they, talk about the Arctic, what they themselves say they're doing up there, and actually questions of climate change, ecological challenges and so forth are very central in the way Russia talks about the Arctic, and they're working pretty consciously to create kind of good governance. And sometimes it's interesting how even concepts which we use on our side of the east-west border are used on the Russian side. And this concept of good governance and trying to, tidy up, they are definitely there. And quite a lot of work is put into that from the Russian side, as far as I can see from the documents I have read.
Yes, I would not argue with that. I would probably posit that the hard security threats still in the Russian thinking about Arctic have much more prominence than the new security threats, which are in fact coming faster than Russia is preparing for them. And one such case was the outbreak of anthrax on the Yamal Peninsula caused by the melting of the permafrost. And still that wasn't really taken seriously enough. In part because for Russia, the rights and the well-being of indigenous people on the high north is not really a matter of serious concern. When Canada is trying to put that in the center of its chairmanship in the Arctic Council, for Russia it's completely foreign topic. They can't really connect on that matter. Russia is not at all a fan, Russia on an official level, of NGO activities in the Arctic, which is something which is perceived as suspicious, uncontrollable, and so on. And the government the efforts are still remarkably militarized even where it shouldn't be. It is the defense ministry, for that matter, which is responsible for clearing up all the environmental damage around all the rusting Soviet settlements, taking out a lot of empty barrels, which is a good thing to do. But why defense ministry? It has kind of other concerns and other strengths. And engaging NGO in this sort of task is out of the question. So in Russian discourse, it's much more the thing that the ice is melting, and that is a factor in increasing geopolitical competition for the Arctic. That is the main thing. What are the other consequences which are immediately already coming? That is a matter of second priority, unfortunately. And I think Russia would pay for that dear.
Yeah, I would just like to add a point on that, and my claim that this is a kind of game that is going on in between East and West, but also within the countries. And I think that's the tragedy, in a way, of security becoming center stage in Russia as it is, because you can see also how it changes the game between the actors on the Russian side. And you see a distinct difference between actually regional actors, for example, in the high north, and central actors, and how the central actors, where, in Moscow these days, the hawks are really ruling, and how they kind of step in to decide what's going on in the regions, where you have the regional actors who are very, very anxious to keep up, the collaboration, to keep cleaning up, for example, the nuclear waste and so on. So you have this empowering of the hawks in a way, because of the increasing tendency of both parties to see this as a security game. And then you have between bureaucracies, So you have, unfortunately, the Russian security services very often now defining activities in spheres that are actually not theirs, So, and this is, of course, the example of the NGOs, like the Norwegian NGO Bellona, who has been working, environmental NGO, working, very well in Russia for many years. If it were up to the Russian environmentalists, of course, it's welcome, they want them, all of that, but those are not the guys who are deciding. It's more the Russian security services, and their view is, of course, that these NGOs, whatever they're doing, if they're working for gay rights, for environmental issues, they are rather part of a sneaky US manipulative hand, or Western liberal hand, into Russia, trying to affect what the population thinks, what in a sense, trying to create a so-called color revolution maybe in Russia. So that's really the tragic thing which is happening there, that these actors who could be, our collaborative partners are not empowered by the fact that the game is so security-oriented.
Yeah, I would say that Pavel's dark cloud is now coming over my head. In some ways, we think of Russia economically, their Arctic ambitions, obviously the security, but my concern is the environmental challenge is actually what we're not talking about. We had anthrax last year. We have these methane craters, the permafrost thaw, what is going to be thawing in that permafrost. And because we are not in a point in our bilateral and multilateral relations to have that early warning, to work collaboratively to understand what these changes are, I just hope we are not surprised when it's too late. My concern is this is, as much as Russian documents talk about sustainable development, and I think they understand it, we've even seen some corrective action in Norilsk because of the extraordinary pollution from that. But this is my concern. And environmentally, catastrophes like Chernobyl, like other things, that was really the beginning of where the regime just could not handle that. So, again, boy, Pavel, I'm usually optimistic. You really made me now think these dark thoughts. So clearly it's time for coffee to wipe away these dark thoughts. So before you go, we're going to take about a 15-minute coffee break, but come on back. We have a great panel assembled to talk about economic issues. But before you go, please thank Julie and Pavel for a great discussion. everyone out in a timely way. And we have such a good panel. I don't want us to miss a moment. So thank you. Welcome back from coffee break. So our second panel is going to dive a little more deeply into the economic drivers of the Arctic. And although you only see, and I know Kristen's going to join us in a moment, you only see 3 panelists here. We actually have one panelist who is with us from New Zealand by phone. It is 2:45 in the morning, my friends. And so we owe Dr. Anne-Marie Brady an amazing note of thanks for joining us. Dr. Anne-Marie Brady is professor in the University of Canterbury. She is the editor-in-chief of the Polar Journal, which is a must-read for polar observers and experts. She's published over 10 books, 40 scholarly papers on a range of issues, but she's really honed in on China's strategic interests in the Arctic and Antarctic. And her book, which again I commend to you, China as a Polar Great Power. Anne-Marie, can you hear us?
Yes, I can, Heather.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. What we've asked to do, because we want Anne-Marie to go back to bed after she's done, she's going to give her remarks. We're going to just pause, and if there's anyone in the audience that has a question for Anne-Marie, and then we are going to bid her a good night and a good rest. So, Anne-Marie, I owe you many white flats for doing this. Thank you, my friend. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Heather. Well, I'm going to be focusing on a whole range of aspects of China's interests in the Arctic, which are not simply economic related. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak today, because this is a topic that I've been working on for more than 10 years. And I've found in my research that, which is based on the Chinese language sources and particularly Chinese government materials, that it is China's interests in the Arctic and Antarctic are a pretty good predictor of China's intentions as well as policies. For example, the Belt Road Initiative or expansion of China's northern ports as hubs, and a much more global focused foreign policy. So China is expanding beyond its borders, like other rising powers that we've known in history. And in 2015, my interest was I was very interested by something that I saw in the Chinese media, that China had identified the Arctic and the Antarctic, the deep seabed, outer space, and cyber as new strategic frontiers, which from the Chinese perspective are all areas of undetermined sovereignty where China can expand and take up advantages that are available to countries with comprehensive national power. Now, the Arctic countries will say, what do you mean about the undetermined sovereignty in the Arctic? Well, that's obviously, there are some points of the Arctic Sea which are not owned by anyone or claimed by anyone, but even when the continental shelf, and if the continental shelf extended seabed claims are resolved, the Chinese analysis quite rightly points out that the littoral states would only be granted sovereign rights and not sovereignty over those extended seabed claims. So from the continental shelf claims. So from China's perspective, the Arctic, as well as the Antarctic, where the Antarctic Treaty permits countries who are non-claimant states to view the territory as there as international space or undetermined sovereignty. The polar regions are part of this new global focus of China's foreign policy that are looking to these strategic frontiers. And China has set itself the ambitious goal of becoming a polar great power within the next 5 to 10 years. And the actual great powers, polar great powers in the world are the United States and Russia, who don't even use this term to describe their capabilities. And the fact that China has adopted and utilised this term is a really strong indication of China's confidence and level of ambition in global affairs. And I don't know if you can see the cover image of my book that has a new official map for China. It's a vertical world map, which has China at the centre of this map. It shows the world island, as Mackinder called it, very prominently, and also the Antarctic and the Arctic Ocean are very strongly featured in this particular version of the world, as shown in China's vertical map. So China's got long-standing interests in the Arctic. Chinese scientists were working with Soviet scientists in the 1950s, and Chinese policy analysis were covering the sovereignty debate between the USSR and Norway in the 1970s, and other issues. I've read classified reports from the 1960s in Chinese about potential of oil and gas exploration in the Arctic. But international commentators noticed China's interest in the Arctic really spiking from 2007 onwards, when Russia planted a steel flag in the Arctic seabed. But China's foreign policy and interest in the Arctic are what I've called an undeclared foreign policy, which is only now being slowly revealed to foreign audiences. And one of the important things to note about that is, or perhaps all the more so than most aspects of Chinese foreign policy, that there is a two-level communication strategy. So there's one message for the outside world, and there's a very different message in Chinese directed at the Chinese public and in the discourse amongst the specialists who work on the Arctic. So unless you're able to access that second level of communication, then you won't really have a clear picture of what China's interests are. So China has three core interests in the Arctic. The first, and ranked in order, is security, and that includes both traditional and non-traditional security. The second is resources, and that includes a very broad notion of resources, basically all the opportunities that might be available to a non-Arctic state in the Arctic. And so obviously China's not going to be taking the resources there, paying market prices for them where it needs to pay, such as oil or gas, or accessing rights or opportunities such as fishing and tourism. And China also, the third category is strategic science. For example, China's the rollout of the Beidou 3 GPS system. The Arctic and Antarctic are very important for that for China. So the Chinese government funded a very extensive survey in between 2012 and 2016, involving a very large number of Chinese scholars, both scientists and social scientists, to assess the resources and the governance mechanisms of the Arctic and Antarctic, basically to find out what was there and what rights China might be able to access, and what limits there might be on China's access in the Arctic and Antarctic. And that assessment helped to back up that understanding of those three core interests in the Arctic. People have heard a lot about the Belt Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road, as it was earlier called, or the Silk Road, or the Arctic Silk Road is another term that has been used just this year. The Belt Road Initiative is a China-centered economic order with strategic implications, and in this new order, all roads lead to China. The Arctic Sea route was included in the Belt Road Initiative in 2014. The Belt Road Initiative links all three of those core interests that China has in the Arctic, from security to resources to strategic science. It is the Belt Road Initiative is classic Mahan, Alfred Mahan, who's the U.S. historian who was a strategist on the recipe for rising powers that they needed to follow. And Mahan is the main influence on China's maritime strategy, as he once was a major influence on a rising Japan in the 1930s. And the three basic elements of Mahan, which we can see in China's policy, is first to set up a blue water navy, second to protect your sea lanes of communication with that navy, and third to establish privileged access to resources. And Mahan talked about doing this through either colonies or through privileged or special dedicated market access, and that's certainly the approach that the second approach is what China will be following when it comes to the Arctic, and has set up a lot of agreements with Russia, for example. And the Chinese sources speak frequently of the Arctic region, but China also has very detailed policies and interactions with the 8 Arctic states, as well as the emerging one, Greenland. And even, for example, with the United States, China has been particularly developing relations with Alaska, being the US Arctic state. China's involved in a Hearts and Mind campaign with different governments and peoples in the Arctic, because negative public opinion will harm China's Arctic agenda. So finally, I would like to make the point that China's actions in the Arctic are also revealing for what they tell us about China's intentions, or as someone put it, the question as to whether or not China is a stakeholder in the global order. So from the analysis that I did in my book, I found that China's actions in the Arctic show us that China will act like other great powers in the past and in the present. It will follow or ignore international law when it suits it, but it won't attempt to overthrow or refute the existing rules. But when there are no formal rules, China will take advantage of openings. And when there are international negotiations underway, then China demands to be at the table. And all of China's recent Arctic activities can be termed as efforts to gain China the right to speak in Chinese Huayuquan on further governance measures in the Arctic. China now regards itself as a legitimate stakeholder in Arctic affairs. Thank you.
Anne-Marie, thank you so much. I just want to quickly turn to our audience if they have any questions. I have one here. And Anne-Marie, let us know if you can't hear. You have to speak really close, Richard, into it. Yeah.
Richard Ranger with the American Petroleum Institute, and thank you, Ms. Brady, both for being up in the middle of the night and for a really interesting presentation. Alfred Thayer Mahan's thoughts were very instrumental in the U.S. decision to annex Hawaii in the late 19th century, and at the time, Hawaii was sort of undetermined sovereignty. The Hawaiians didn't think so. They thought they had sovereignty, but it was a point of competition between the U.S. and Japan. Is part of China's view toward the Arctic, with your term undetermined sovereignty, being one of moving a chess piece there to place us in check, because we've really not done much to take advantage of the Arctic coast that we have?
I think that the rules of the international order are a little bit different from, say, the last century or the century before. So I think that a country like China doesn't need to formally declare a colony. In fact, in the 1800s, colonialisation went out of favour. New Zealand is a former colony, and Britain was actually relatively reluctant by 1840, when New Zealand was colonised, to take on a new colony. Colonies are require a lot of governance and resources. But a country can be dominant and influential over another nation while that nation retains its sovereignty. And so I think that we are seeing China expanding its interests internationally, and they will they are developing very, very close interests with governments in regions of the world where they want to work, and there has been a very very assiduous campaign to win the support of Arctic governments for China's place in the Arctic. And, a little over 10 years ago, when Chinese analysis really started to expand on the Arctic because of the actions of Russia, that really stirred up China to move a bit faster on existing interests and plans. China wasn't regarded as a legitimate stakeholder in Arctic affairs, and China had to work really, really hard and expand its whole range of activities in order to gain that acceptance of its role. So that's a long answer to your question, but I think that there is a slight difference now. I think that in global politics we're not likely to see much colonization, but those strategic territories are areas where any country in the world that has the resources and the human resources as well as the financial resources to expand their interest and take up opportunities. And China is not the only emerging power that is looking to expand into the Arctic and Antarctica, for example, as well as the deep sea bed and outer space.
Anne-Marie, this is Heather. In the reading of China's Arctic White Paper, was there anything in that white paper that surprised you, anything that cut or struck you as particularly important?
It looked very familiar to me, and it looked. I thought that there were some missing bits, like the strong interest in security that China has. I've been encouraging Chinese scholars and government officials, whenever they would listen to me, that they should be more transparent about their intentions in the Arctic and Antarctic. The other governments who I've studied on Arctic and Antarctic affairs, like the United States, for example, are pretty transparent about what their interests are there. So I know that was a noticeable omission. But the other aspects of the Arctic White Paper, they had been well signalled and rehearsed in the preceding months and years. When China was talking about issuing a white paper, many of the points there had already been raised with different governments. So where I was surprised actually was when it did go public, was that there was a little bit of attention about the fact that the Belt Road Initiative was included in the Arctic. I think that might have been new to some commentators, but it was, as I said, it was signalled as early as 2014.
Anne-Marie, thank you so much. It is always such a privilege to get your insights, and to provide a cogent presentation at 2:45 in the morning is above and beyond the call of duty. Anne-Marie, thank you so much. I'm going to ask our audience to applaud you, and then I want you to go back to bed.
Okay.
Thank you, my friend. We'll now turn to our panelists that are not waking up, but bright and alert and ready to help us with some great insights. We're going to start with Tero Verasta, President and CEO of Arctia Group. Tero is going to be dual-hatted because he also chairs the Arctic Economic Council, as Finland is now the chair of the Arctic Council. We know Tero from his frequent visits to Washington, helping inform us about icebreaker construction and technology, and I'm sure you'll provide some of those insights, but we're also hoping that you will help us get up to speed on what the Arctic Economic Council is doing. It's 4 working groups. A new working group has just been added to that, and really how business, circumpolar business, is developing. And after Tero finishes his presentation, we will turn to Professor Jacob Godsmirski, research professor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and my boss as he's guiding us through this grant that focuses on the Russian Arctic. Jacob's going to give us some of the insights of how Russia is really crafting and creating its Arctic policies and looking at broader trends. And then we are going to conclude with Christina Woolston, Vice President of External Relations for Quintillion. You may have seen Quintillion's name in the news, a very large New York Times article a month or two ago, because Quintillion has been working very hard to put together be a high-speed broadband provider for Alaska, and thinking about how to put subsea fiber optic cable that could stretch from Tokyo potentially to London, and thinking about the Arctic and Arctic broadband and looking at some of those important commercial applications. I'll hasten to add that China is also thinking about laying some undersea cable from Finland to China. So we're also what we call the digital Arctic, looking at how the digital technologies can transform the Arctic. So my job is to get out of their way, and let's turn to some insights. So Tero, over to you. Thank you for joining us all the way from Helsinki.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Heather, and for the CAS for the invitation to be able to meet with all of you today. It's a great privilege. So let me start with the Arctic Economic Council developments, and then move on with the expectations on the polar navigation and the Arctic navigation, and how the shipping is expected to develop within the next couple of years or even decades. The Arctic Economic Council was established 2014 when Canada was chairing the Arctic Council, and one of the overarching themes then for the Canadian chairmanship was economic development. And due to that fact, a task force was established, and the task force recommended that a circumpolar business forum, which was then renamed to be the Arctic Economic Council, to be established, and it was established. And when the establishment took place in Canada, we continued then the work as the US took the gavel, as they took the gavel on the Arctic Council as well. And we stated the sort of the overarching themes of our work. And actually the first one has become very, very timely, which is market access, i.e. the freedom of trade. And unfortunately, we've seen developments around this area which are going the opposite way. The US is pulling out from TTIP, or it's at least put into a halt, or frozen. Maybe we need an icebreaker for that. Yeah, I can provide you 8 icebreakers to make the ice to be broken. We have this status with the sanctions, the halt of the TPP in terms of the US. So that actually moves the freedom of trade developments towards the Far East areas. So last September, I was visiting Vladivostok in a meeting where this area's trade development was discussed, and 3,000 people visiting over there. And in the final panel, we had Prime Minister Abe, President Moon from Korea, and President Putin, and the notion was that the free trade development is going towards this area. So my first argument here is actually that are we, the so-called Western areas, moving out from the free trade and endangering ourselves? And you can notion this also on the trade developments between China and the US. The sanctions are already hitting the industry, and it's also surprising that for us, for instance, when we're a European company, you could say that the US sanctions don't apply with us, but yes, they do. Because if there is an issue with a client who is then somewhat related to US trade, that means that maybe we are sort of restricted in moving forward with the trade. So this means that this first overarching theme is very, very timely. Public-private partnerships, those are important for us because of the fact that within the Arctic areas there's an investment potential for $1 trillion. However, only 4 million taxpayers, so we need investment potential. And there we come to China. And definitely China's investment potential is visible in the Arctic. There are already hotels in the Finnish Lapland which are invested by Chinese companies. Big increase on the Chinese tourism in the Finnish Lapland area, whereas tourism is one of the main focus areas of the Arctic Economic Council as well. In terms of the regulations within the Arctic, so unified regulations, schemes which allow the companies to get the return on their investment, high-level regulations, that is of high importance as well. And noting the fact that it's an area for small and medium enterprises. So for instance, in my country, the small and medium enterprises gain more than 60% of the revenues within the Arctic businesses, so that is of high importance. We have more than 50 members now. We already have members from countries outside the Arctic, from China, from Korea, from Germany, to name a few, so we are making progress. All the working groups are active, the Energy Working Group and Arctic Stewardship Working Group, Maritime Services Working Group, and importantly, the Connectivity Working Group, where we already had 2 Arctic Broadband Summits. The first one was in Barrow, and the next one is now going to be in Hokkaido, so I welcome you all to participate to this event. So the Arctic Economic Council is moving along well, gaining lots of activity, lots of interest, especially from the Asian areas, so we're happy with the work. So going then to the maritime issues, and let's start by looking into the Arctic strategies of the 4 countries which we are talking here now. There are actually 2 issues which are noted on all of the Arctic strategies of these countries, and it's the environmental aspects as well as international collaboration. So Russia, China, US and Norway all promote these 2 areas. However, if you have a look into the economical developments, that actually varies already quite a lot. And within the US Arctic strategy, you don't see that many notions about the potential for the economical developments. Then when you go into the security issues and national sovereignty issues, it's Russia, US. Whereas, as we already learned, China is saying that, yes, we are going to participate into this area as well. The Polar Silk Road, this initiative was stated last summer as part of the One Belt, One Road strategy and the idea, and that actually combines Russian and Chinese developments in terms of the Northern Sea Route collaboration. So there is an agreement which came out last July in terms of making the investments together. We've already heard about the Yamal LNG and the investments on this one and the Chinese interest over there. However, there is new developments in this area as Russia has just introduced new legislation around the Northern Sea Route, effective 1st of February this year, which, to simplify, sort of reduces the opportunities of foreign flagged vessels to operate on the Northern Sea Route in terms of oil and gas transportation as well as icebreaking. And additional restrictions are expected beginning of January next year, whereas these transportations could be limited into Russian-built vessels. Well, I'm not expecting this to materialize because we have Japanese, we have Australian, we have Chinese investment power in the vessels of Yamal LNG. So if this would be materializing, that would mean that the Yamal LNG transportations would stop, which cannot be the case. But this is also a sign of protectionism, and about this legislation, we heard in Japan a couple of weeks ago in a conference a statement by a Russian government representative, well, this isn't anything else like the Jones Act. So it was considered as a countermeasure to the Jones Act, and we learned from Admiral Zukunft this morning that don't touch the Jones Act. Exactly, yeah. So it's a development. Regarding blue economies, the IMO introduced the expectation to go into the heavy fuel oil ban just a couple of weeks ago, even though without a time frame, but that is a work in progress. An example of blue economies is my company's most recent icebreaker, the Polaris, which is the world's first icebreaker running on liquefied natural gas. So we can go to Yamal and take some LNG from there. So maybe you should consider this type of icebreakers in the US as well. We have the technology.
We'll let the Coast Guard know.
Exactly, I've done that. IMO Polar Code, of course, that is an important area for the developments regarding the Arctic shipping and its safety. Well, then I was asked to have a look into identifying the dynamics of the expectations of the Arctic shipping, and that's really an interesting area and interesting issue. So let me start by stating that, of course, it's about international trade developments and the international trade. Whereas actually, even though the international trade is increasing, now for the first time last year we noticed the situation that the trend which was increasing the international trade between the market areas turned down. So that means that unfortunately protectionism works in that way. Second important area is, of course, freedom of trade. And within the freedom of trade, it's even more important in the Arctic areas, because within the Arctic areas you definitely need the best available services and best available practices, because the area is so pristine. So if you can't use those, we can actually argue that you endanger the sustainable developments. Freedom of navigation. Already also learned this morning that there are different types of views in terms of the freedom of navigation within the Arctic. However, no big challenges have been seen yet. So that remains to be seen, whether if there is additional tension, whether somebody wants to really challenge this. This is not an issue for the commercial players. For instance, for my company, it's very easy just to follow whatever the rules are. So it's easy. We want to do the trade, and if there are certain regulations like the NORDREC in the Northwest Passage area or the Northern Sea Road regulations, it's not a problem for us to follow. So that's a political question, actually. Ship resource availability. So we've seen the fact that there's new types of vessels which are able to work without icebreakers. Unfortunately, I'm not a fan of those, because I like to assist with my icebreakers. However, new icebreakers are needed as well. There's around 140 icebreakers in the world, whereas their average age is around 25, 30 years. So we need new capacity for that as well. On the Northern Sea Route, we have destinational traffic and you have transit traffic. The expectation on the increase of the destinational traffic is that it would be going into 40, 50 million tons within the next 10 or 15 years. However, in terms of the transit traffic, there are different types of drivers, which include the developments in the Suez Canal, the security developments in the Suez Canal, as well as piracy. So there is, for the moment, no piracy in the Arctic. It's still cold enough. They're not a friend of the cold. But if there is a big change in the Suez Canal security development for a reason or another, that might shift the gear actually quite rapidly. You never know. Tourism. There's a great increase in tourism in the Arctic areas, and that is definitely one of the drivers for the future on the Arctic shipping. And of course, the regulations. Then we have an interesting development, which is the transportation corridors. So there is an initiative to build a railroad from the Arctic Ocean to the Baltic Sea and include that to a tunnel linking Helsinki and Tallinn. So creating this type of corridor and link that to the Northern Sea Route, and that is something there, this sort of EU notion comes to play as well, because of the EU funding and the EU motorways of the seas developments. We can't forget oil price. So the oil price has become from $50 to $75 within a year. Many people say that Arctic drilling offshore drilling starts to be economically viable if you go to maybe $80 or $100 or something like that. New leases are again becoming a fact also in the US Arctic. So maybe that is going to be the case within the next couple of years as well, and it's happening in the Russian areas as we speak. So there is great expectation on this one, and in terms of the fact that Finland has been sort of a mediator, and there's been discussions about the opportunities as we are chairing the Arctic Council that Finland could host a high-level summit to discuss the issues. We address the problem that there is no forum to discuss the sovereignty issues within the Arctic context. So this might serve with this case, and our president has been active on this one. There's been the dialogue or the forum for the Arctic military commanders, but they have not met in 2 or 3 years because of the current situation. My expectation is that the Arctic shipping will have moderate development. Yes, COSCO shipping, for instance, from China is increasing its traffic, but it's been, 20, 30, 40, 50 vessels, something like that in terms of the transit. I'm not expecting a big boom on this one. Yes, moderate increase on that one, but the destination traffic is another story, so there will be increase on this area as well. And let me then conclude my remarks with a proposal. Since Finland is now chairing the Arctic Council, and we've seen that there's been developments like the oil spill response agreement, which is legally binding, the emergency preparedness agreement. So in terms of the Arctic resources, why shouldn't we have an Arctic ice-breaking collaboration agreement? Meaning that once we have great assets which are running idle on one part of the Arctic, and on the other part of the Arctic you have a need of resources. So are we stupid here? Why don't we do something about it? Should we do this shared economist thinking around this issue as well? And because the Arctic Council is also working great on these types of issues which are related to search and rescue, so we could relate this idea for this one. So let me leave the CSIS with this proposal and hope that you will move forward with it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You got a presentation and I got a homework assignment. Okay. Jacob, please.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share my insights on the Russian Arctic policy. When we agreed on the program, I saw that I was facing a huge challenge because I was given 10 minutes to present you the nitty-gritties of the Russian Arctic policy making. So I decided to approach this in a kind of from the bird's eye perspective, and also decided to go to the very source. First, we have to understand that if we want to understand Russian Arctic policy, we have to understand within which political framework this Arctic policy is being designed and realized. It's about 2 key questions: who has the interest in the Arctic in Russia, and who has the power in Russia. And only when we look at those 2 aspects of the Russian policy, we will be able to understand how this policy is being made. And we have also learned that there is a lot of interest in Russia in things Arctic. I happened to take part in this Arctic Forum in December 2017, and this picture provides a very good map of the key concerns Russia has when relating to the Arctic questions. And this has to be viewed against the broader framework. There is this understanding of Russia as being a network-based state. There's this concept of Russia being a dual state where formal institutions play a certain role, but informal networks play even a far greater role. So I decided to look at how this Arctic policy is being realized within this network state framework, and I also decided to go to the very source. I decided to look at how the story of the Russian Arctic policy is being told by the Russian government itself. So I went to the official website of the Russian government, identified a tag that they use in order to describe their Arctic policies, Arkticheska деятельность is Arctic activity, and I discovered that between 2008 and 2018 there are 106 events that are by the Russian government itself defined as relating to Arctic policy. And I used this collection of texts to map the Russian Arctic interests. It gives us some understanding of who are the key actors in the Arctic policy, what are the key topics, and what is the geographical focus of this policy. And what I'm going to present on the following 3-4 slides is based on the kind of statistical analysis of the text of this Russian official coverage of the Arctic policy. It should be underlined here that this is a kind of top layer of the Russian story about, official story about the Arctic. There are plenty of documents that describe those approaches to the Arctic in more detail, but I decided to take this bird's eye view perspective because I think that taking this bird's eye view perspective will give us a good understanding of the priorities. Because, and my assumption here was that the more you mention an issue or a topic in the text at this top layer of the Russian narrative on official narrative on the Arctic, then we should assume that the more often you mention this term, the more important it is for you. So this is a kind of the very basic assessment of what I'm going to present now. This gives you an understanding of the Russian activity on the Arctic. It's a kind of representation of how many times per year this Arctic activity is being mentioned on the official website of the Russian government. And we see that there is a peak in 2015, and then there is a kind of downward spiral. I should make a reservation concerning 2018. This I collected those texts in March 2018, so it's not a complete coverage of 2018, but we see a kind of steep increase in the Arctic interest in the Arctic activity, and then some ups and downs. We have to, having in mind the high level of personalization of Russian policy, we have to understand who is in charge and who is in kind of responsible for this Arctic policy. And we see that 4 or 5 names are mentioned at this top level of this narrative. Dmitry Medvedev is obviously a person very much in charge, but Dmitry Rogozin is the second one, and Arkady Dvorkovich is mentioned 9 times, and Sergei Donskoy, Russian Minister for Natural Resources, is mentioned 1, and Maxim Oreshkin, who is responsible for Russian economic development, is mentioned only once. In order to understand what is the kind of power of those actors to put their mark on the Arctic policy, it's also important to place them on the kind of informal power map in Russia. I used the collection of annual rankings presented by the Nezavisima Gazeta. They publish those rankings of top 100 political figures in Russia on monthly and annual basis. I used for the purpose of this brief study the annual rankings and placed those actors, not Putin, not Medvedev, because they are usual on the top of the list on this power list. And we see that Rogozin has a kind of specific trajectory on this map. Dvorkovich has also an active, an interesting trajectory, and other actors are deemed to be much less important. What is especially interesting is the relatively weak position of Alexander Novak. Alexander Novak is Russia's Minister of Energy. He is responsible for the sector that generates a lot of revenue for this Russian state budget. Until 2015, oil and gas-related revenues formed 50% of the Russian state budget revenue. So having a man who is responsible for the sector and not having a very high position on the Russian informal map of power is an interesting issue. Then I also used the very same approach to mapping the topics that Russia is very preoccupied much, and the size of those fields represent the importance of the topic. What I did here was that I took the whole text from this top level of the Russian description of the Arctic politics, and I decided to conduct a kind of statistical analysis of the content, and then I grouped some of the issues into kind of topical clusters. And we see that, for instance, when we were to follow the Russian popular debate on the Arctic, we would most probably be amazed by the very high level of securitization of things Arctic. When we follow the Russian official policy and the way it is represented, security and military questions are not very high on the agenda. What is very high on the agenda? I have also to make a reservation. I removed from this list two terms that are very much predominant in this collection, Arctic and Russia, for obvious reasons, because having them here would somehow make the picture less clear. But there is a lot of focus on maritime activity, a lot of focus on various aspects of development in the Arctic. There is a very high level of state activity, government state is referred to quite often, and we see also that things that are related to various aspects of energy policy are also very high on the agenda. Gas is mentioned 28 times, natural resources, mostly petroleum resources, are mentioned 20 times, LNG is mentioned 14 times, oil-related questions are mentioned 15 times. So it's, this really gives you a good understanding of what is the hierarchy of Russian interests in the Arctic. What is even more interesting is this geography of Russia's Arctic interests. I decided to look at what geographical units are mentioned in this series of documents, and discovered that there's a lot of focus on Yamal. This has much to do with the development of the Arctic energy resources. Sabeta is mentioned 10 times. This is this new report that is used to send economic energy resources to markets. Regions are mentioned 8 times. For some strange reasons, in those Russian government documents, Spitsbergen or Svalbard is mentioned 16 times, and this has something to do with the perception of Russia that sees Spitsbergen as a kind of very special case regulated by a very special international law arrangement. Barents is mentioned 5 times. We see that there is relatively little focus on, for example, Yakutia, that is the biggest Arctic region in Russia, mentioned on 1 time. So this also gives you a kind of good understanding of what is the geographical focus of this policy. And then this policy making takes place mostly in the Russian State Commission for the Development of the Arctic, that is headed by Dmitry Rogozin, and that has focus on those so-called Arctic key zones. Some years ago, a document was published about the so-called oporne zony w Arctique, and those oporne zony could be translated into key areas of development, and there is a number of projects to be realized in those Arctic zones. In order to understand who is involved in this policy making at this more operative level, I conducted an analysis of the affiliation of the actors who are members of this State Commission on the Arctic questions. And we see that there is a huge domination of state actors, 21 representatives of the Russian government. There is some representation of business, private, but also of those people representing state-owned companies operating in the Arctic. Relatively little involvement of the political class, only 2 members of the State Duma and 1 member of the Federation Council, and all Arctic leaders are included. I also decided to look at what are the topical affiliations of those members, and discovered that regional development has a huge interest, and the second on the list are those who to work on defense and security related matters, meaning that this lack of focus when it comes to topics is maybe counterweighted by the activity of those actors who represent this Siloviki faction in the Russian government on this map. And then, in order to understand who is really interested in Arctic, I conducted a series of searches using official websites, search engines of the Russian state institutions, and to discover how often Arctic is mentioned in those official websites of the single institutions. And we see that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs shows a great interest in the things Arctic. The second on the list is, in fact, Ministry of Defense. Very low on the list we see, for instance, Ministry of Finances, but this has maybe something more to do with the fact that the research engine is not very effective, because when I used Google website to conduct the Arctic research for the Arctic on this website, then the situation was slightly different. I got almost 200 hits. So this really shows you what is the institutional interest in the things Arctic in Russia. And the last but not least, it's important to understand what is the current state of the Russian debate on the Arctic. I went through last month's coverage of the Russian Arctic in Rossiyskaya Gazeta and discovered, for instance, that Dmitry Medvedev, when he gave his speech on the State of the Nation on 20th April 2018, he mentioned Arctic only once. So this means that Arctic is most probably not very high on the current Russian state agenda. There is also something that is important to understand, that there is special wording when it comes to Russia's coverage of the Arctic. They use quite often two verbs to describe Russian policy towards the Arctic: освоение, which means development, and покорение, which means conquest of the Arctic. So those are the two dominant verbs used in order to describe Russian policy. And I also discovered that I was very happy with this new report that was published in April 2018 by Russian Agency for Political and Economic Communication. They were somehow assigned the task by the Russian government to look at the importance of various projects that have been realized in the Arctic, and they published a list and a kind of brief assessment of the Russian policy in the Arctic. And I would really recommend this one to all those who are interested in learning more about Russian Arctic policy, because this is the most current assessment of the effects of the Russian policy in the Arctic. And knowing that Admiral Zukunft will join us for this event, I also decided to look at what is the Russian understanding of the US policy, and I identified one statement presented in Rossiyskaya Gazeta, where there is a kind of expression of some concern for the United States caused by this lack of icebreaker capacity in the Arctic. So I will stop here and will give the floor to Christina. Thank you.
Jacob, thank you so much. I so want you to map the U.S. government's Arctic. I want you to do the same thing for the United States, and then I want to do a comparison of that.
It can definitely be done, but then we have to agree on the price.
To be continued on that. Kristen, let me help us understand, end us on sort of what a digital Arctic looks like in the future. Thank you for being with us.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I will try my best to fit within the 7 minutes that we were allotted here to get through my piece. And I really wish I would have stuck with my Russian when I was in college, but I wasn't very good at it. Quintillion is a private company headquartered in Anchorage, Alaska. Privately funded, we have just completed the first subsea fiber optic cable system in the United States Arctic. But first, I would like to just very briefly touch upon something that may have risen to the news across your desk or in your company. Regrettably, last year, Quintillion CEO, we discovered that there were some fraudulent activities, and this involved some investors and falsification of records. We did an internal investigation. Our board, our investors acted very swiftly and quickly and did an an internal investigation, turned this over to the Department of Justice. And then for the last 7 months or so, the Department of Justice has been conducting its own investigation. It recently became public. It was something that we dealt with last year, but the situation became public after the conclusion of the investigation. The good part of this is that our investors and our customers have stuck with us. The system has been built. It went into operation on December 1st of 2017, and our business case is as strong as ever. The customers that we have are 10 and 20-year take-or-pay contracts, so from a business standpoint, very solid present and future for the company. But I did want to be sure to touch upon that. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to grab me afterward in the lobby. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. This was October 27th, 2017. This team completed the final splice of the first, as I mentioned, North American Arctic subsea fiber optic cable system. It took us roughly 3 years of subsea and terrestrial construction in order to reach that day. The network, and I'd like to talk briefly about the construction of it because it is quite historic and groundbreaking. But we built new terrestrial network from Fairbanks to Prudhoe Bay. Prudhoe Bay, as many of you know, Prudhoe Bay Dead Horse area is the largest North American oil and gas development exploration field. And we're seeing with ANWR, the 1002 opening up, as well as other finds in Smith Bay along the coast of Alaska, a tremendous amount of activity in oil and gas. In a situation where with better oil prices, the proximity and the ability to move forward with some of these projects are beginning to see some light of day, which we're very excited about. Our system is anchored by connecting to existing fiber, which runs south from Fairbanks into the Pacific Northwest. All of Alaska is connected to the World Wide Web, the world internet, through those 2 cables that run to the Pacific Northwest. So Quintillion's network has extended north and to the west into the remote, rural, and coastal Alaska communities that you see on the map. From a strategic standpoint, which I'll talk about briefly in a moment, we, as the gateway of the U.S. Arctic and as a strong resource state, we do believe that the infrastructure that we've built is just the first place in creating a digital environment in the Arctic, as well as the potential for a tech corridor. Through the course of 2015 and 2016, Quintillion operated in the coastal waters off of Alaska. So we had a window roughly the end of July, beginning of August through the middle of October when we could operate our vessels. We had 13 vessels in the water in 2016, 8 vessels in the water in 2017. We laid over 1,100 miles of subsea cable. The cable was laid in 4 separate cable spreads. We worked around the migratory patterns of the species, the migratory mammals in the Arctic. That included whales, walrus, polar bears, seals. So we took great pride and great pains in working locally with the co-management groups, the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission, the Barrel Whalers Association, as well as COERIC and other nonprofits that are charged with migratory protection in that area. The system that we installed runs at about 30 terabits per second. So when the system went live on December 1st of 2017, we dropped 200 gigs into each of the 5 remote communities into Alaska, and the system has been built for the future. The system is built for Alaska's needs, as well as what we see as the future of the Arctic and telecommunications. We've made this a world-class system at every level. I showed you 2 slides ago. This is what our cable looks like. The small strands of fiber optic glass in the middle are what transmit all of the data. Everything else is built for protection in the Arctic. We have buried every inch of this cable along the seafloor up to 4 meters deep in the areas where we have seen the most ice scouring activity. We spent 2 years surveying and mapping the seafloor to look for any historical ice scouring, and while we couldn't tell if the ice scouring was 10 years old or 10,000 years old, we decided to go deeper than any present ice scouring, which meant that we had to use some significant equipment to trench and bury the cable, as well as creating a fiber optic cable that's very it's reinforced. And Taro, this interests you, but we had to take multiple ships to the Arctic to carry the cable because it's double armored and it's a lot heavier than typical cable that you see in the subsea areas. Because the water is shallower off the coast of Alaska, that's why we had to bury, but also the ice movement in the area. And on the coastal areas where we went from the shore-in connection, we took even greater investment in time and resources. From the shore end, we used horizontal directional drilling techniques, and it's with steel boring tools. We went down 60 to 80 feet, and then we went out a mile offshore. So the fiber is buried in steel conduit in place, roughly a mile offshore. And this allowed us to, one, protect the cable, but it also allowed us to avoid any coastal impact by not cutting into the coastline. Every 30 kilometers, is a repeater, and this boosts the signal, so the latency issue is avoided, and this is built, as I mentioned, just for Alaska as well as for the connection internationally. We use concrete mattresses to further protect the branching units into each community. So it's a trunk and branch configuration, meaning that if should anything happen to one of the connections into a community, it doesn't affect the others. We currently have a backup satellite, but once we are connected with our international fiber, as I'll show you in a moment, that allows us, as well as the state of Alaska and the U.S. Arctic, to have multiple fiber paths. We used a remote operated vehicle. This went along the seafloor and checked every inch of what we installed in 2016, as well as what we installed in 2017. So in 2016, we finished all but 40 miles of our 1,100-mile subsea cable system. And that was because we experienced a weather situation that was unlike had been seen in the last 25 years. Sea ice went in and out multiple times. We had to cease operations. We weren't using icebreakers. We had to use ice managers, which gently managed the ice around the area where we were laying cable. So it was a great disappointment that we did not finish in 2016. However, it did allow us the opportunity to, for 2 years now, we've seen and have been able to monitor live the network as it's operating. And we have 2 years of fault-free, flawless performance on our network. And so that was one thing that we didn't plan for, but at the end of the day, gives all of us great reassurance about the impact that we have and the installation that we've successfully managed. So our network is allowing for opportunities. It is a transformational system, one that we are very proud of. And as we look forward to the next steps for our network and what that timing looks like, we think it brings even more opportunities for a number of industries as well as a number of communities. So phase 1 went into service, as I mentioned, December 1st, 2017. Our next phase is to connect by the early 2020, end of 2019, optimistically, to connect to an international fiber outside of Alaska. We will begin surveying this summer. Construction begins next summer. We'll have pretty specific information to announce in the next couple of months what that exactly looks like. But our goal, we are aggressively moving towards this, and this meets the need of both our international system as well as the need for redundant telecommunications in the U.S. Arctic. So again, by end of 2019, beginning of 2020, our plan is to have an international connection into Japan, as well as the potential to connect back into the Pacific Northwest at that time. Our phase 3 plans are progressing in simultaneous fashion, but the plans are, it's a difficult build, and we foresee in the next 3 to 5 years having an accomplishment of phase 3 connection internationally into Europe. What that looks like is still in development, and of course we are talking with Taro and others about what it means to lay cable in either the Northwest Passage or the lower Northwest Passage, as this map shows. We do have a fairly near-term opportunity and goal as we look to diversifying both U.S. Arctic and the Northern Canadian terrestrial network, fiber network, of dropping a line into a Canadian community just inland, or across the border of the U.S. and of Canadian border. So those are things that we're looking at in the very near future, but we're excited for the first time for Alaska to have true, diverse fiber networks in and out of our state. So this first slide was developed by Jason Seslovich by Senator Dan Sullivan's office. And this looks at the strategic location of Alaska as the Arctic state and the Arctic border for the U.S. As you can see, the militarization of Russia has been much more advanced than Alaska in the U.S. In this part of the world. So we see that every infrastructure development meeting the demands that we will see for all of these strategic plays in the Arctic. Transportation, militarization, trade, economy, all of these pieces, research require a certain level of infrastructure, and telecommunications is certainly one of a very important piece of that puzzle. Next, we see earlier, Julie on the earlier panel was talking from the Norwegian and Russian relations strategically and militarily. We see Norway's recent, I think it was last year, they announced that they would be building the largest data center. We think that the Arctic is perfectly positioned for a number of technology advancements, tech corridors, attracting tech companies to move north. There are a number of things that provide benefits for potential tech areas, but they require multiple paths of fiber connections. And that's just one of the things that we won't have until Quintillion is able to connect its network internationally end of 2019, beginning of 2020. So we're very excited to see technology and industry looking to the northern latitudes for relocating and for investment. And then finally, what we're seeing in the communities in Alaska is as I mentioned, transformation within our communities. I was born and raised in a rural community in southwest Alaska. My parents still live there. It's the largest commercial fishing region in the entire world for red salmon. And they, too, rely on, regardless of the fact that it's very remote, they rely on technology. They monitor fish, and they allow fishermen to fish each day once they have the catch recorded, and they have to upload that to the Alaska Fish and Game website. Unfortunately, they have many restrictions in the technology there and the capacity, and so it lags, and so fishermen are not seeing the economic opportunities that they could were they able to communicate in a timely manner with these resources. The community of Nome is one of the communities that we turned fiber on in December. The Nome City School District recently turned over from a microwave and satellite-based system to a fiber system. They're saving roughly $200,000 a month for a 100 meg connection into that community. Hospitals, for the first time, will have the capacity to digitally transmit and communicate with experts on a health basis. So we're excited about the education, the health, as well as the economic opportunities that a true high-speed broadband network will bring to these communities. So this is just the first. We've only been in service for about 4 or 5 months now. So in a year and 2 years, we're excited about what this will look like for the communities. We are a wholesaler, so we don't provide services to the end user. We sell to the communications companies, and they provide services to the schools, hospitals, and residents. Thank you very much for your time.
Kristen, thank you so much. I know that we're speeding you through that presentation. I think this question of the Arctic connectivity, a working group within the Arctic Economic Council that came out of the Arctic Council's broadband task force, so important to connect very far away communities. We are out of time, but I think we can probably take one question, unless you have been so filled with Arctic knowledge you can't take it anymore. They're so filled with knowledge, they cannot take it anymore. But no, this was, thank you so much. It was a rich discussion of strategic opportunities for state actors, for companies that are seeking those opportunities, for how governments coordinate all of these efforts. I have to say, I have not answered the questions today. We were trying to divine, is the Arctic a strategic pursuit, a great power miscalculation? I come out in the strategic pursuit, but the economic questions are still, to me, a little fuzzy. My crystal ball isn't clear. There's great potential, a lot of dynamics going into that. So clearly we're going to have to come back together again and keep figuring this out and keep our crystal ball on the table. But thank you so much, Anne-Marie, who's hopefully blissfully asleep. For Tara, Jacob, Kristen, thank you so much. And thank you, as always, for joining us at CSIS. Have a great day. Thank you.